Yes.
And we are live and recording. So quick introduction before we dive into the Greco-Persian Wars. My name is Lisa Engelbert. I'm a new joinee to your group. That is a benefit, I guess, to us having to do these things online now. I found your group through Meetup, so very happy about that. I am not an historian or archaeologist or art historian. However, I strive to be. I'm doing a lot of studying and really enjoy ancient history, especially the ancient Near East. And I am not presenting alone, fortunately. Richard, do you want to say a few words, introduce yourself?
Richard, you're on? Hello? I think you got kicked out. Hold on.
Got kicked out. Okay.
Yeah, I don't see. He was in and then he was out.
Okay.
All right. So, I mean, we all know who Richard is. I mean,
Okay.
he's our, resident presenter.
Got it. Okay. So I'll go ahead and continue on. You'll notice that I've only listed the years 490 to 480 BCE, and that is really because that's the concentration of what Richard and I are going to be jointly speaking about and all. So I call this our battle plan. This is going to be a two-part series. Our first part, where we're going to be focused today, is on some background information. The background information, we may be touching on some things that have already been touched on in the group. I wanted to do that just to, again, set some context, and I'm trying to do it specifically in the lead up to the Persian-Greek conflict. So apologies if folks feel like we are doing a little bit of rehashing. I think it will just help to set the context. And then our battle for today is on Marathon. In part two is when we'll actually talk about the break between the Battle of Marathon and then Thermopylae and Artemisium. And we'll talk about the battle. And then we'll also talk about the legacy of these wars. So to start off with, I wanted to do just a very high level timeline of what was going on in the Greek-Persian conflict here. So these are the key events. And what we have here is really the starting off with the battle, not the battle, excuse me, but the colonization by the Greeks of Ionia in what is Western Anatolia, or what we would call today Turkey, right? And that's happening in the 8th and 7th centuries. And drivers for this colonization is, Greece is a very small landmass, and it doesn't have a lot of space to do a lot of farming and make it a very productive land. So they were looking for land. There's also a lot of infighting within the Greek city-states. So there's political factions and people are being driven out or choose to leave. And then there's also the sense of adventure and settling outside. For those that are familiar with Plato's writings, this is kind of the visual, I suppose, he had in mind when he made the comment about Greeks are like frogs around a pond. And you can see this looks very pond-like up here at the Black Sea, but pretty extensive throughout the Mediterranean. In 557, we have Cyrus that actually, after the Greeks are in the region of Ionia, they expands the Persian presence and becomes more of an empire. And the Ionians that are up here, they become part of the Persian Empire. There's a revolt, which we'll go into in more detail, that really is a precursor to the Greco-Persian Wars, in which the Ionians, again in that western region, along with other Greek city-states, rise up against the Persians and just say, we don't want to be part of the Persian Empire, and we're revolting against that. In 492, we got Darius I invades Greece in retaliation for the Ionian revolt. And we have the northern regions of Greece, Macedonia, and Thrace give fire and earth to the Persians, meaning that they accept Persian rule. The Battle of Marathon is the Greeks are victorious in that particular battle, and that's as much as we'll cover in this first section. Then in the second section, we'll go into what happened in 480, which is August and September, which is jam-packed with all kinds of battles that are happening. And we have a Tempe Gorge line that is held in 480. Actually, I think that was 490, but I'll double check on that. We have the Battle of Thermopylae, in which the Persians are victorious, but we have a lot of legacy around that. We also have the Battle of Artemisium, which is happening at the same time that the Battle of Thermopylae is. The Battle of Salamis, in which the Greeks are victorious. And then lastly, the Battle of Plataea, in which the Greeks are victorious as well. Down here, we have a photo image of the tomb of Cyrus the Great. And then over here, we have an image of what is, I guess, fondly called the bust of the Spartan king Leonidas, who was the leader at Thermopylae. However, it is likely not Leonidas, but people still like to, I guess, gravitate towards that and identify with that.
Yeah. Now, one of the things that I wanted to note actually about the tomb of Cyrus the Great is that it is the last tomb that is built in Pasargadae. One of the defining aspects of the Persian Empire up to this point was that King Cyrus had said that the Parsis, the people of Pars in southern Iran, the ancestral region of the Persians, needed to stay in this region and needed to rule from this region. So they had the capital at Pasargadae specifically because it was in this harsher region, and so that's why they buried him there. But one of the changes that Darius makes as he tries to make his empire more unified is that he moves the capital from Pasargadae to Susa, which is in a lowland region closer to the Iraqi border, if we're looking at modern day. And the advantage of that, of course, was that it was a very useful administrative capital. It was very easily accessible. But at the same time, it meant that Darius was sort of leaving, in a certain extent, the power of the historic Persian region. So he was not buried in Pasargadae the way that Cyrus the Great was.
Right. Moving on then to the key battle sites of the Greco-Persian wars. We do have the actual battle sites that are listed out in the red dots here, the red stars, and we start with Miletus over here on the Ionian coast, which is significant in terms of the Ionian revolt. That really was kind of a key end of the conflict between the Persians and the Greeks, in which the Persians are victorious there. So that's called out. Then we have this Tempe Gorge, which I did briefly mention, and that is up here in the north. I have it identified as a black star because there really wasn't any kind of a battle. There wasn't an engagement at that point. Artemisium and Thermopylae, those are kind of what I'd consider to be like sister battles. One is land-based, one is naval-based, and that takes place in 480. Then we have Plataea down here, and that takes place in 479. Marathon, which we'll talk about today, is in 490. And then Salamis, which is taking place in 480 BCE as well. What I think is really important to point out here, and why we, always look through a Greek lens, why this was such a significant endeavor. If you take a look at all of the regions here that are in the lighter green up through Thrace, right? Those are part of the Persian Empire. Then you go over to Macedon, and that's a Persian vassal state. Thessaly, moving further south, is a Persian ally, as is this region right in between, which is, I believe, Boeotia. And all.
Yeah.
And then in purple, we have the neutral city-states that haven't chosen sides between the Greeks and the Persians. And so that leaves actually very little in terms of both land mass as well as people that are willing to take a stand against the Persians. It's a very small group of people.
Before we move to the next slide, I want to point out, you see how there are those three fingers that jut from Thrace. Those fingers are called the Chalkidiki, and are part today of Macedonia, and that time they were part of Thrace. If you look at the easternmost one, you can see it sort of juts out from the peninsula, and that will be very important in our discussions of the first Persian attack, because that is Mount Athos. Mount Athos today in modern Greece is a site of a Greek Orthodox monastery, but at that time it was considered one of the centers of the world. It was a very tall mountain, and very strong winds would come around it, making sailing around that area very treacherous.
All right, let's talk a little bit about the Greek war mentality as we're going into this discussion. So we're talking about the 5th and the 4th centuries BCE that this is applicable to. It was a time that people really, the Greeks really understood war because, for instance, Athens was at war 3 out of 4 years. And the longest duration of time without war was consecutively a 10-year stretch, and that was it. People just had it in their minds that war was just a part of everyday life. The word Andrea in Greek is courage and bravery, and it really translates into manliness, and it has to do with the warrior spirit. And then, of course, for the Spartans, they take it even a number of steps further. An early and violent death was just to be expected.
And I would say further, and your quote "with it or on it" sort of implies the Spartan mentality, where if you didn't die a violent death, if you died a death of old age in your sleep, that was somehow less of a show of manliness than otherwise. I also want to make a quick note on Andrea. Andrea comes from the word andros, which is the Greek word for man. So Andrea is really the idea of masculinity. And so you have this tied idea of masculinity with courage, bravery, courage and bravery and fighting, and this entire idea that it wasn't a manly way to be. It was somehow divorced from your nature as a person to not be in this brave sort of fighting stance. Yeah, it's just an entire mentality around that's what a man is supposed to do.
Hey, Richard,
Yeah.
I told that to my girlfriend Andrea one time, and she did not appreciate that.
Whether she was supposed to be a manly perception of courage and bravery and go out and die on the battlefield for you?
No, just the origin of the name. She thought I was wrong, and I should not have said that.
Oh, okay.
Are you still together?
That was back in college.
So just to piggyback on what Richard is saying, so this saying "with it or on it" was what the Spartan women would send their men off to war with, which is, you know, with it means you come back with your shield, and you fought bravely, courageously, slaughtered people, or you come back on it, meaning you're dead, and your fellow hoplites are carrying you back from a glorious death. If you were to show up without your shield, you were banned. They had no interest in you at all.
Yeah, one of the ways that the hoplites would carry a person back was because the body was so heavy, was oftentimes they would chop the head off and carry it on the shield, which is where the on it comes from.
Mm. All right. Armor and weapons, again, we have talked a bit about this, but I do like this image to showcase some of what we can imagine what they looked like when they went into battle. So you have, of course, the horsehair crests on the bronze helmets. And the bronze helmets, and we'll see a photo of one later on in the presentation, but basically it covers everything, your ears, all around on your cheekbones, your nose. So you just really have these eye holes to see out of. You've got a bronze for the Spartans. You have bronze cuirasses that cover both their front and their back. For other Greek hoplites, they actually have transitioned at this time into something that's a bit lighter weight, so they have more mobility and flexibility and not so much heavy stuff to carry around. Then you also have the bronze leg coverings, thighs, as well as the shins, and you'll notice that they are barefoot. In terms of weapons, you have their infamous shields here, which are comprised of wood as well as a thin coating of bronze on them to make them sturdier. You have a shorter dagger or sword, and then you have their very long 2 to 3 meter long spears that they're using here. So definitely being encased in all of this metal is extremely protective. At the same time, it's extremely heavy, and if you can imagine wearing metal all over your head, only having eye holes to see out of, you have very limited audio as well as peripheral vision. So there are some disadvantages to being clad this way.
Also, how much does it weigh?
I think it was 70 pounds.
Yeah, I was going to say that's what I thought. It was about 45 kilos, something around there.
Yeah.
And
And
if you think of
another
the
thing, if I
average
could,
weight, do we have a sense of the average weight that they had? I don't remember looking that up, but like as a person.
There are
I-
various estimates, but some are as high as 50 pounds.
No. I meant the average weight of the people. Like
I thought you.
The
average
humans.
weight of the kid.
human average weight. Yes.
They were smaller than people.
Well, yeah. I mean, we know that, but I don't know if we know like if the male average weight was 150 or 140, because there is this ratio basically of how much you can carry for a long period of time, and if you get anywhere between 50 and 75% of your body weight, you really can't carry that. You can carry it, but you can't do anything with it, right? You have to,
Right, or
Right.
if you're wearing it, you'll be exhausted after a very short period of time.
yeah, I mean, you really can't. Like even when I was in the army, like you maybe have 130, 40 pounds worth of stuff, but you dump 100 of it, right? And that's what you'd cache, or that's what you'd have in your, in your
bunker.
or your base.
Aaron, we'll post it up on the chat, and then somebody can look it up and maybe dump it. Sergio also had some to add. Apologies, because we have
no big deal.
76 slides to go. Sorry, guys.
No, not for today. Not for today.
Yeah,
No,
Don't
not
worry.
for today. Oh, I
Not
got
for
a
today.
scared. I was
No,
like,
no, no.
okay, let's just.
I
move
know.
along.
We're going to be here
Zach, don't
until
worry.
7
We're
o'clock
going to
tonight.
take our time. We're going to hear everybody's opinion. Don't worry. We'll be here till 4:45 in the afternoon. So everybody's got nothing
So
to do.
once you have your hands free, Mr. Richard, why don't you look it up, the average weight? It's
I did
interesting.
look it up. It says 60 to 65 kg for males, 50 to
That's
55 for females.
65 kg for males would be
140.
about 140 pounds, 150 pounds.
Yeah, height was 162 to 165 centimeters.
Hold on. So
That's quite short.
Yeah.
that's half of their weight, basically, that they have to carry with everything. That's
Yeah.
ridiculous.
That's a lot.
Well, but I know that they were physically fit, but it's almost only the aristocracy was physically fit. So I'm not sure.
But it's sort of absurd because they had a weapon that was pretty much the size of them, and they carried half their weight. I mean, it's like
Did
it's
they
kinda
march? Did they march carrying all that stuff? Could they
Like, you
use
had to. I
Yeah,
mean,
no, this-
packed animals?
Yeah, no, this was actually a huge bone of contention among most historians for quite a long time. We're going to talk about the march during the Battle of Marathon.
yeah.
And until about the mid 70s and 80s, most historians couldn't believe that that march could take place just on the Greek description from Herodotus, specifically because of the weight that these men were carrying. But it took one courageous history professor to walk over to the phys ed department and ask them to actually try it, and they were able to successfully do it. Now, of course, as Aaron has made quite clear, the physical dimensions of the people at that time are different than the physical dimensions of the people in our time. So what we can do, they might not have been able to do.
Well, yeah, and the real problem actually, it's your dehydration and calorie burn. So when you put all this extra weight on you, it's not a 1-for-1, it's a 2-for-1 relationship. So that's one of the reasons that percentage is real. Yeah, and it's real for mountain climber. I mean, it's not like this isn't a military thing. This is like a human carrying thing, because the amount of calories you need basically doubles when you carry half your own weight because of the distribution of the weight. It's not.
And another good point I was going to say is that the armor that they're wearing is bronze, which is a metal, which conducts heat. So you got to think about, they're always fighting in the summer months where these bronze breastplates and helmets are going to get even hotter. So, you know, that's kind of a drawback when you're wearing that kind of equipment, you know, for long periods.
And if any of you have ever been in Greece during the summer, you know that this is absolutely nothing to joke about. I mean, it's, you know, being out in the middle of the day in the sun in Greece, it is brutal.
Yeah.
One comment from a professional heat transfer engineer. Conducting heat in this case would be positive, not negative factor, because it will allow easier distribution of heat from the body outwards.
So what you're saying, is it promoting then sweating? So it's actually...
Yes, sweating is different. Sweating, you have to evaporate your moisture, which takes heat and helps the body to release the extra heat. But as far as conducting, just from the pure conductance of heat from the body outward, it's better to have better conducting material than worse conducting material.
Yeah, and let me just add, the psychology is totally different too. I mean, we seem to be looking at these people from our standpoint. Just the fact that the Romans would march all day and then put up a campsite at night. Some modern militaries don't do that, even though they're supposed to. I mean, people just different then, you know. And
yeah, but I mean, there is this dynamic where, you know, you aren't breaking biophysics when it comes to hydration and calories, right? Like there's no magic Roman blood drinking that you do to do that. I mean, it's at the end of the day, you do have to provide enough calories and hydration or else your people will fall apart, right?
But look at some of the things they did, Aaron. I mean, they did things that by today's standards were just not possible. Hannibal going over the Alps. I mean, it's not like they had crampons or anything. They marched over the Alps in snowy conditions, icy conditions, took elephants. I mean, you know, things were different then. It's hard to judge them by our standards. And even the physical stuff. Yes, we know what the physical thing is today, but even in baseball, like in the 1910s, they're playing in flannel uniforms in summer and all day games. I mean, you know, people are just different. It's hard. If you judge everything by presentism, you know, it's just not going to work. Because
I mean, that's fair. I think there's something fair to that. But at the same time, if you're trying to sustain a force over time, you only have so much energy, right? Like energy is biophysics, right? So if you spend all this energy getting somewhere, we're not going to have that much sustainable energy.
Listen, let's just continue with
let's
the
continue
theme, because we're digressing too much.
Yeah.
All right. So another visual I really liked actually is it's something that I found on Penn State, as well as, and this is an image of the Phalanx. And so we have talked a bit about, you know, people marching in formation and all, and, you know, using all of that imagery of how the Spartans are actually not comporting themselves, but what they are wearing. Their shields, their long spears, all of the bronze that they're wearing. You see here the shields with unique emblems on each of them. The one thing that they did have all in common on their shields was the letter L for Lacedaemon, which is where Sparta is located, the region. And then each of them chose their personal emblem. And all, and you can see how tight the formation is, as well as, you know, the shields are protecting each other to their left on the sides, but also in the front. And then you see the position of these really, really long spears that people have pointed out, and then the ones that are in the back that are getting ready should they move up to the front. What I wanted to call attention to is something that I had never heard about before, and that was, you know, because of the limited audio and peripheral vision, one of the ways that the Spartans were trained and how they kept in formation was through music, actually, and rhythm. So there was this concept of really like a war dance and staying coordinated through music, and that is the role of this fellow back here to help with that, playing some sounds. Now we talked about armor as well as the kind of like the war mentality, but then sorry, somebody had a question or a comment?
Yeah, I had one with regard to the spears and the phalanx formation, yes. Just to bring attention to it. I recently went to well, not recently, but went to a Civil War reenactment thing, and they did a talk about how when you have those multiple lines, it is really a challenge to get everybody when they're so tight and they have those long weapons, you know, in the Civil War situation, it would have been rifles, where you basically aren't hitting the person in front of you, you know, as you move forward. And so the entire drilling with regard to how to handle those spears in a tight moving formation, you know, whether the spear is up or at an angle or is directly going forward, there is a lot of drill and symmetry and coordination involved in, again, just not hurting each other with those things. So it is an extraordinary accomplishment to get these phalanxes, working together in that manner effectively. So.
Let me just comment that this is one of the most controversial topics in all of classical studies. And there are major academic conferences held of international experts coming together and arguing about what were phalanx tactics, how did it actually work, when was it introduced, how did it evolve. So what you're seeing is only one possible reconstruction of what phalanx warfare was about. Maybe we can talk about that more in the question section, so I won't say any more right now.
Okay, cool. Thanks everybody for your comments. Then moving on from like a war mentality to actually talking about what were the Greeks up against in terms of uniting under kind of like a Pan-Hellenic force to combat the Persians. You know, so the Greeks were very city-state focused, very polis focused, and there was a lack of political cohesion and unity among the city-states. At the time that we're talking about, there's an estimated 1,000, give or take, city-states, and you remember back to the map, the frogs along the pond, they're spread out all over the place. There are monarchies in terms of government. There are also republics. There are tyrants. Sparta is unique in that it has a diarchy, meaning that there are two kings that rule at this time. So they have a lot against them in terms of unity, like we look at Greece today as a nation. There was actually a lot more to be said about being a Persian sympathizer or medizer. At the time, Persia rule was tolerable. They weren't tyrannical in the modern sense of the word. They weren't directly involved in the day-to-day. They weren't heavy-handed. They didn't demand certain things. They demanded that they were part of the empire, but their rule was relatively acceptable. And also the Greek city-states that did not support a Greek resistance to Persia, they really felt, and who could blame them, that they had more to lose than not when you look at the sheer number and vastness of the Persian Empire. What they do have in common across these city-states is a shared religious beliefs and practices. There are differences, but in general, there are some shared fundamental religious beliefs. There are some social and societal norms that they practice, just some cultural customs that they practice. And then most importantly for them was just that they shared in a common language. And I'll just bring in, hearing about when Greeks would refer to people who did not speak their language, they called them barbarians because they spoke barbar, meaning they didn't speak Greek. So those are really the three things that binds them under a Greek umbrella or a Hellenic umbrella.
Yeah, I would say further with the Medaizers, the Medaizers wouldn't have been that out of place in other civilizations as well. Most of the peoples that were conquered by the Persians saw them as a group of people who were effective administrators, but then left local affairs in the hands of dignitaries who were promoted to the positions just below the satrap, right? The satrap would be the head of the province, and then below the satrap would be the large-scale bureaucracy, and the large-scale bureaucracy would generally be made of locals. So generally, the Persian Empire would lead to an increase of economic prosperity. What made the Medaizers controversial in the Greek case was that Greeks put a lot of emphasis and importance on the ability of self-governance and independence, and that's why you have over 1,000 city-states that can barely marshal up, a few thousand hoplites in their own defense, because they preferred the autonomy to the organization, which is what became one of the linchpins in the conflict between the Persians and the Greeks.
What was the Persian tax burden on the colonies? Do we know?
I don't know the exact percentage. I don't know if I'm sure the Persians recorded it. I've just never looked at it. From what I can tell from the way that different peoples reacted to the Persian rule, it was never onerous. There were rebellions, but they were very few and far between, and they were mostly centered around the Greeks. Most of the other nations didn't revolt. I'm unaware of any Egyptian revolts, for example, any revolts from the Medes, any revolts from the Babylonians. And the other major issue that they had was on the Eastern Front, was with the Hephthalites in the Northeast. In fact, it was the Hephthalites who we're going to talk about with respect to Cyrus. But generally speaking, we don't see the response that you would get if the tax burden was onerous.
Actually, if I may add, there was an Egyptian revolt in 486.
Oh, okay.
Prevented Darius to continue his campaign, because he had to deal with that. But he died, and then Big Xerxes, had to deal with that revolt first before continuing.
Okay, sorry, thanks.
Greg is right on that, and I'm not sure it was because of the taxes. It was more likely.
Yeah, I'm not sure because of taxes. Yes. No, I'm not saying it's because of taxes.
I think it's also true that geography played a part, so that even within the Persian Empire, people who lived in more remote areas would be able to be somewhat resistant or autonomous of Persian rule, because there was more trouble to subjugate them than just to leave them alone. If you lived in the lowlands, you had no choice because the Persian might was overwhelming.
But also, just a general question, I apologize. Not a question, but Scythians, they didn't have policies, right? Like the Greeks had, right? So it's easy to tax a policies, so to speak, which is the city-states versus Scythians. So, I mean, they're, nomads, and what we know, right? Darius, I don't know if you'll get to it, has been chasing Scythians for a while and couldn't.
Well, I mean, the thing about Darius and the Scythians is you win every battle, but you can't win the war. Because they'll just retreat further into Ukraine. I generally avoided the discussion of the Scythians because I didn't think it was directly relevant to the Greco-Persian situation. But generally speaking, yeah, Darius could defeat the Scythians at every engagement they had. It's just he couldn't take over the land because there was just too much land and it was too sparsely populated to be effectively taxed. So he sort of settled for a vassal/tributary relationship. Of course, yeah.
I actually wanted to add that the Ionian revolt was also not about tax. It was about the Greeks resented the tyrants that were imposed on them by Persians. And those tyrants, they were relying on the Persian military might, so they were not necessarily pursuing the interests of the population, unlike the earlier tyrants of, let's say, Pisistratus. He was very populist.
Yeah, and go ahead.
We will get into some of that as well, Greg.
So, sorry about that.
All right.
Yeah,
No worries.
Maybe John, one last question, and then we'll
did the Persians ever try any co-opting of local elites like the Romans did? Was it possible to advance?
That was a huge part of the Persian system. In many cases, as Greg mentioned, the tyrants were put in power over, for example, the Ionians. Many of these tyrants were locals who were somehow related to previous tyrants. But they were people that the Persians believed they could control or that they could influence very strongly until the point where they would more directly assimilate them into the empire.
Yeah, they certainly did it in Judea. They relied on the priesthood of the ones that they allowed to go back.
And this goes all the way back to Cyrus. I mean, the Persians were politically astute and knew how to leverage the factional disputes in the places where they wanted to assert powers. They were very, very good at that and very clever.
Thank you, guys. Let's just move on for the sake of time, and then we'll.
No, don't worry, Zach. We're moving on a really great pace. Don't worry about it.
I do want to then touch on Athens and Sparta and their complicated relationship, because they are really the leaders of the Greek resistance to Persia. There are others that participate, absolutely, but they tend to be the leaders of the resistance. So I'll point out like two key antagonists. There are others. This is definitely not an exhaustive list by any means, but I want to tell just kind of an example of a story of how their relationship evolves just up to the point of the Persian Wars taking place. So two of the antagonists are the Spartan king Cleomenes I and the Athenian ruler Cleisthenes. And in 545, roughly, the Athens are ruled by the Pisistratid clan, which I think, Greg, you just recently mentioned there in the conversation. And they were tyrants. They blocked political freedom and were offensive to the Spartans' belief in some kind of participation by the citizens. Cleomenes the Spartan actually marches on Athens and ousts the tyrant Hippias, who is of the Pisistratid clan, and he actually paves the way for Cleisthenes to come in with his new reforms, which involves much more of the Athenian assembly, creation of an assembly, and people actually participating in some type of self-governance and all. His reforms, though, did have some offense to Cleomenes, and in 508 he returns, and with the intent of actually the person that he just got into power of ousting Cleisthenes by instilling somebody who is much more Spartan aligned, which is Isagoras. Cleomenes will try and try again. He'll be enlisting the help from other city states, and he is unsuccessful to do that.
Okay, go ahead.
Go ahead, Richard.
Oh no, I was going to say, so the Spartans are engaging in the same sort of nation building that we in the present are trying to engage in, putting rulers who are favorable to them, and then finding out that they might not have the same intentions in the long term.
That's a great parallel. Yeah. And just a quick note about Cleomenes. He does come to a gruesome end. He is basically a Spartan king that I guess he loosely played with the rules. He approached the Delphic oracle, bribed the oracle to denounce his co-ruler, the Spartan king Demaratus. This is found out, and because of it, because it is against things that Spartans stand for, he is imprisoned, he's humiliated, and he ends up going mad. And to the point, at least according to some of the stuff that I was reading, that he ends up flaying himself alive while he's in prison.
And his brother Leonidas came to power after he was ousted.
He is they're not step brothers, but they're not completely on the same line. And he and Leonidas, the Spartan king Leonidas, will marry his daughter Gorgo.
So Lisa, quick question. Based
Yeah.
on the fact that the Delphic Oracle took money to make a prediction, why did anybody ever listen to a Delphic Oracle again?
Great question. I can't answer it, but it is not a unique example of the Oracle being bribes, actually. There are other examples as well.
all the time. They've been doing it all the time.
I mean, you can say the same about modern religious figures, right? There are numerous scandals in insert religion here, and yet people will still take the word of individuals from insert religion here. So it's for a lot of people, an aspect of faith is not connected with the discordant or aberrant behavior of individuals who are important practitioners of that faith and leaders of that faith.
Lisa, I had a question on the prior slide. I didn't quite catch what you said there. So about the next to last bullet point. So the Spartan king ousted the Athenian king?
And you're breaking up. I don't know.
Yes, no, and that's completely right. The Spartan king launched an invasion of Athens, where Athens was ruled by a tyrant. Now, a tyrant in Greek terms doesn't refer to somebody who rules maliciously, just somebody who rules without hereditary history and without democratic fiat. So it's a dictator. So you had these dictators from the Pisistratid line. The last one was Hippias. So what ended up happening is that the Spartans, led by Cleomenes, attacked Athens and removed him from power.
And did that answer your question? I'm going to move us on.
Yeah, she's had technical issues. Go ahead.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, well, actually, if I may add to this particular thing, I mean, the Hippias was actually ousted by the population because he became very brutal after assassination of his brother Hipparchus, and he was in the Acropolis besieged by the people, and Cleomenes just wanted to take advantage of, this chaos, and that was the time when he came and tried to install like Socrates.
Thanks for that clarification, Greg and Richard. And just a quick note on this. This is a modern bust that you find right now in the Ohio State House.
Okay. Yeah.
Go ahead, Richard.
I was going to say, just keep Hippias in mind because he's going to play a role later in the story.
So concepts of freedom and what's important basically to Sparta and Athens, just continuing on their differences here, is that Sparta actually, which was new to me, was the first to experiment with, quote, a free citizenry, where the Spartan citizens actually have some say in their government and how they're ruled. They do have that reputation, as we just saw in the story, with Cleomenes helping to oust Hippias, of going in and deposing and opposing tyrants. What was important to them was religion and ritual, hierarchy and obedience, and a very high standard, I guess, in my mind, and again, it's a modern mind, I'm looking at it kind of like a puritanical way of living. Now, one of the things that was a bit bothersome to other Greek city-states is how they viewed slavery. And the Helots, as we have talked about in the past, were enslaved people. What made it offensive to other city-states is that they were enslaved Greeks. They were not enslaved foreigners. That was what the sticking point was. They also, sorry?
They were Mycenaeans.
Mycenaeans, and
yes, that's another region in Peloponnesus, west of Laconia, west of Laconia.
Right, and so that was to the west, and it also had very fertile farmland, if I seem to remember, and that was really the reason that the Spartans wanted to control that area. Right.
There are real similarities between the Spartans and the Japanese, just referring back to Aaron's presentation of a few weeks ago.
Yep. Yeah, this idea that the foreigners who were around them were somehow lesser than them, and therefore could be brought into industrial or agrarian services. I think that's a really great parallel.
Also, that acts that are taken to attack these slaves are seen as proof of manhood and proof of acceptance into, you know, adult war bands and so forth. You know, you go out and make your bones by killing a helot.
Right, exactly. You proved yourself as a Spartan by killing a helot, yeah.
You mean how sweet and nice everyone was to each other, and just
yes, it was love. It was love and fraternity. So much loving that they couldn't even stand to be alive by the end. Just so much loving.
Exactly.
Yeah. Also, teenage bands were involved in that, you know, because they were. Yeah.
Right. It was kind of like a passage for the Spartans to actually go through that, or they were specifically chosen, I think, to be part of this like spy group or something that would go out on nighttime missions to actually kill helots.
And the Spartans were, young men were purposely kept hungry. They did not have enough to eat, to encourage them to steal but not get caught, because they'd be severely punished if they got caught. But it was the situation was created where it was necessary for them to do it to survive.
Yeah. Okay. In addition to the helots is another class of people that sits between the citizens of Sparta as well as the slaves of Sparta, and they're called the Perioeci. Their translation is outdwellers, and these were people that were still Greek, but they were not acknowledged as citizens. They had more rights, but they didn't participate in, say, any kind of governance. They performed things like trades and crafts. They were not doing the work that the helots did, which was more agrarian or domestic in nature. They were doing more commercial or trades, crafts type of a thing. And a quote that I found about Sparta, it was from an Athenian, so you have to understand that that's the lens that's being viewed by, and it's from Critias of Athens. And he said, in Lacedaemon are to be found those who are the most enslaved and those who are the most free.
Yeah.
For Athens, there were a couple of points that were really important to them at the time of the Greco-Persian engagement, and that was freedom from external coercion. And so you can see there's a direct conflict right there by being part of another ruler's empire, and also a freedom to participate in and decide matters for their community.
I would also say that Athens had a sense of freedom in that they celebrated the arts and writing and these other sorts of things. It would build up in a little bit after this as well, but the Athenians also believed themselves to have cultural freedom as well. It wasn't just political freedom. And that's something that could be challenged within the Persian Empire. All right. So I guess this is my first slide. One of the things that I want to sort of talk about is the Persian sources, because this is something that Greg had brought up. There aren't a lot of Persian sources from this time period. So how do we know what the Persians were thinking? So there are several different signposts we can use. The first one is what the Greeks say about what the Persians think. Herodotus spends a lot of time in the Persian Empire, and so we have his views of what they thought written down through his lens, but it's still somehow based on what they think. You have other references to sort of Persian culture that sort of crop up in this period, usually written post-Alexandrian conquest. You have inscriptions from the tombs of the Persians themselves, of the Persian kings themselves, and what they valued, although in many times they didn't really talk about this specific aspect, the Greco-Persian War. And what I think is the most interesting is that you have modern Iranians who have written about this situation. But probably the most famous is Amir Mehdi Bedi. He wrote primarily in French, so his stuff is a little bit more accessible, but of course it's really famous in Iran, where it was translated back into Persian. He lived in exile after the defeat of the Shah in 79. And he wrote his book in the 80s and 90s. So one of the interesting things politically about modern Iran today is that because the Islamic regime sees itself as really coming out of Islamic history and not out of a historic Iranian culture, this period in time is not really emphasized. But if you compare that to the period of time before, when the Shah still ruled Iran from the Pahlavi dynasty, this was considered the beginning of the Persian Empire. And in fact, in 1971, there was a celebration for 2,500 years. As a result of the Achaemenid period being a central part of the Persian identity, a lot of the names of the people are preserved in modern Persian in a way that they haven't been preserved through the Greek into English. Probably the most strange one to our ear is Hachameneshi. Hachameneshi is actually the correct pronunciation of Achaemenid. Hachameneshi comes from Hachamanish, which was the name of the familial ancestry that the Achaemenids wanted to trace themselves to. In fact, in the empire, they just called themselves Khashacha. And Khashacha literally meant the empire. They didn't distinguish themselves as an empire of something. They've only taken this name in reference to other foreign powers. They would say that they are the Hachameneshi. And the reason they call themselves the empire is because they believe they had dominion over all the world. Now, the three kings, of course, who are relevant in this time period are Cyrus, whose Persian name was Kurush, Darius, whose name was Dariavush, and Xerxes, whose name was Khashayarshah. So obviously we will have a pop quiz at the end to see if you remember how all the Persian pronunciations go. On the right-hand side, you can see a picture of Darius. Yeah, so you can see how the English name is based on the Greek transcription of how they thought or how they could best render the name from the Persian. So the fact that Greek doesn't have a sh sound resulted in the sh of Khashiyarsha becoming Khasiyarsa, and then the kha was represented in Greek with the letter chi, which is an X letter, which is how the X came into English. So Khasiyarsa became Xerxes. That's like, but it shows you how many iterations it is removed that we are from the Persian context.
So quick question: if like you speak Farsi, is that correct?
I can get my way around Farsi. Okay. I don't speak it.
So what's the correct way? Like if you're talking to just someone who's not a history nerd, and say what we would say Xerxes or Xerxes.
Yeah, well, Xerxes is the correct English name.
Yeah.
But if you were talking to a Persian in Farsi, you would say Khashayarsha.
Oh, okay.
That is the name. The same way that, like, I'm trying to think of a good example. It's the same way that we call him Columbus, but his Christopher Columbus, but his Italian name, his Genoese name when he was born was Cristoforo Colon.
Oh yeah, you're right. That's great.
Right,
Richard,
right. Like
what about
it's that.
What about the Cambyses? How do you pronounce
Cambyses? I actually don't know how his name is said. I can look it up for you. But
okay, well, I could probably ask my wife.
Yeah.
While Rich is looking that up, I might mention that Kurush or Cyrus makes its way into the Bible as Koresh, and it's a very important name for Christian evangelicals. He's a very important figure, and that's how David Koresh of the branch Dravidians got his name.
Oh.
Yeah,
really? So
Cyrus.
he's actually Cyrus is actually like his. So Koresh is really Cyrus.
Kurosh.
Yeah. Kurush. Kurush became Koresh in Hebrew because in Hebrew the vowels u and o are interchangeable. So Kurush became Koresh, and Koresh came into Greek as Kiris, and Kiris came into English as Cyrus.
Well, that helps during Bravo TV night. There you go.
Exactly.
My wife said the Cambus is pronounced Kambugia.
Kambugia is correct, yeah. In Old Persian, yeah, Kambugia.
When the name that the Persian for Xerxes, it sounded like with the syllable Shah.
No, Shia.
Shia. Is that related to the title of Shah?
No, different spelling.
Okay.
Kambugia.
I should also mention they all spoke Old Persian. which is vastly different from modern Persian. It's like,
yes, Old Persian was vastly different, and it was written with cuneiform. I wrote it in Arabic, so I would remember how to pronounce with that modern Arabic script, because I would remember how to pronounce it. If I put up the cuneiform, I would have forgotten. But the names of the people were preserved between Old Persian and Modern Persian. The actual words, like for example, if you went to the Behistun inscription and you were to teach a Persian person today how to read cuneiform, because they were using cuneiform as a syllabary, if you taught them how to read the cuneiform, they wouldn't be able to make heads or tails of what was being said there.
And Richard, where is this image from? Is this Behistun?
No, I think that's actually from Darius's tomb in Nakhchi Rostam.
Okay.
Well, there's actually another image from Nakhchi Rostam, I think, that I have in the presentation, but we'll get to there soon. So let's go to the next slide. So it's sort of important to put the Persian mindset where they were coming from. So the empire was built by Cyrus the Great, and he was coming from the area on this map that's identified as Persia. You can see from the topography that it's a very highland region. It was also a very dry region, which meant that the Persian people, at least in their own self-perception, were harsher and also more rugged than the people in other areas of the country. They first revolted against the Medes. You can see where Media is to the northwest of Persia. As the Persian Empire expanded under Cyrus, it came to control new territories, and a lot of those territories were economically affluent. So there was this attempt by Cyrus's courtiers to convince him to move outside of Persia to make his capital, and he resisted. He basically said hard countries breed hard men, and so accordingly you need to stay in a hard country or else you will become soft like the soft men we've conquered. So they developed the capital of Pasargadae. You can see the Pasargadae in the Persian highlands, and one of the important aspects in Persian culture was the ability of man to change the environment, right? So Persia was a very harsh territory. It was on the edge of a desert. And so the idea of being able to make a garden there was considered an incredible feat of engineering and power over the environment. So the water that was used to generate this kind of garden was seen as a powerful symbol of Persians being able to make the world follow their own way. So even though there was a palace built in Pasargadae, the real gem was what was called the Paradeisos, or the large garden that existed on the side of the palace. This was a garden that was literally this, like a city-size park where there were animals, the king could hunt there, there were lots of different trees. This word Paradeisos was sort of the image that a lot of biblical writers would have when they described the Garden of Eden, right? This sort of paradise with lots of streams of water and trees and animals and fruits and all these kinds of things. And the Persians were very proud of this ability that they had to turn what was functionally a semi-arid area into a lively spring. Now, Cyrus, as concerns our Ionian story, conquered Lydia when he defeated them in the Battle of Timbra in 547 BC. Now, after he defeated the Lydians, he didn't take, because Lydia was to the east of Ionia. It's within the Anatolian Plateau, and it was relatively wealthy. After defeating their king Croesus, who is specifically known in Greek legend for being wealthy as well, he was no longer interested, and he moved to the east, to what's now modern Turkmenistan, and he fought against the Hephthalites. As we've talked about in previous history classes, when Cyrus fought the Hephthalites, that was his final battle. He died in battle, and he was buried at Pasargadae in that tomb that Lisa showed us towards the beginning of the presentation. Now, he set the rest of his generals the job of conquering the Ionians and putting down any other revolts in the western part of Anatolia. To him, this area of the empire was not that important, and because Persians were such a land power, controlling the sea to them was sort of seen as an anathema. And so they didn't want to expand beyond the coast. So Cyrus really saw the Greeks as the Greeks in the Anatolian Peninsula as being the edge of the world he wanted to rule. Once Darius took power from Cyrus, after Cyrus was killed by the Hephthalites, Darius assumed power, and he decided to move the administrative capital to Susa, because now that this empire was so large, it needed a functional administrative center. However, he created this dual capital system. So Pasargadae no longer was the capital. It was shifted to a city just to the southwest of it, which was Persepolis. That's the Greek name, of course, the city of the Persians. And in the southwest, you have Susa as the administrative capital. So you have these sort of two capitals, and Darius would rule from Persepolis, but most of the bureaucrats would stay in Susa. We can go to the next slide. And when Darius built Persepolis, it became the center of the world. You can see in the right-hand side sort of a color imagining of what the palace of Persepolis would look like. In the lower left-hand side, you can see the steps that you can see in the lower left-hand side, the sort of green and yellow colored areas. Unfortunately, when Alexander the Great conquered Persepolis, 200 years in the future of what we're talking about, he burned the whole thing to the ground. And so all that's left is that lower step structure and some of the columns. But you can imagine this would have been a very impressive fortress to come to, an impressive palace to come to, and was a show of Persian power. You can also see in the color photograph how much life there is. There's so much greenery there, which all required that water to power. If you look closely at the image on the lower left-hand side, you can see that all of the soldiers are created uniquely. They're dressed in the customary styles of the people that would come to the temple. You can see, for example, that some of them have sort of square hats and some of them have sort of rounded hats. The square hats would have been Persians and the rounded hats would have been Medes, for example. And what was being represented in those sets of people who were dressed very distinctly and carrying different items was the representatives from across the Persian Empire. And it's seeing really the might and grandeur of the Persian Empire reflected in the architecture. In the Persian mentality, they controlled the world. And so these were all the nations of the world that they had brought to themselves. That understanding was where the term Shahanshah, King of Kings, really came from, right? Because you had the kings of all these different nations, and they all reported in this sort of way to the King of Kings, the one who ruled over all the kings. Of course, cultures and civilizations that were heavily influenced by the Persians, such as the Jewish culture, took the term King of Kings to refer to their god. But in the Persian view, the Persian emperor was not a god. He was simply a person who was entrusted with this power of watering the world, of growing the world.
I just wanted to add, if I may, between Cyrus and Darius, there was the rule of Cambyses, son of Cyrus, who actually expanded Persian Empire into Egypt. I mean, that was his major achievement.
That's true.
Yeah, and then also a short rule of his brother Bardia, or maybe it was an imposter. We don't know, but that was for just less than a year.
Yeah, no, that's
I know. It's just I'm being, kind of.
And one thing, Richard, if you could just speak to a bit as well, is that you've got this huge, vast empire, and just the engineering, the roads, the postal system to keep that administration in place. Could you talk a little
absolutely.
bit about
there were massive roads across the Persian Empire. They weren't paved roads like the Roman roads would be, but they were carved dirt paths. And there were numerous places that horses would be able to be tied up, so that way a person could sleep over at like one of these inns where the horses could be tied up and then go forward. You had very effective communication within the Persian Empire. In terms of the bureaucratic management, we're going to get to the satraps on the next slide. So let's do that. So in Persia, the country was divided basically along ethnic lines. And so each of these ethnic territories was called a satrapy. And each satrapy would be ruled by a satrap. The satrap would be appointed by the Persian emperor. and would usually be somebody who was locally knowledgeable and able to control his territory. Now, the satraps were not hereditary rulers, right? Since they were appointed by the Persian king, they served at his pleasure, and he could remove them if he wanted to. But the satrap was responsible for setting up all the bureaucracy below him. He was also responsible for creating his own army and defending his own jurisdiction. And he was able to implement whatever laws were necessary in order to maintain law and order, and doing things that were distinct for his own area. So it might be that the people in his area worship a different god. He's allowed to build temples to that god. It might be that the people in his area are more maritime. He's allowed to continue building a navy, even though the Persians, right, didn't have a history of navies. They were a land force. You had all of these different almost countries within the Persian Empire, all reporting to the King of Kings. And you can see the diversity of the satrapies in the shape and armor of the Persian army. You can see, for example, in the picture on the right-hand side, this is a modern recreation of 3 different soldiers from different parts of the Persian Empire. You can see that their clothes are different, that their shield technology is different, that their formations are different. And typically, armies from different parts of the empire would march in parallel, but not integrated, because they would fight differently. So it wouldn't make sense to integrate them into one unitary force. You had a number of different parallel mercenarial groups that were all under the Persian banner. The only exception, of course, to this was the immortals, who were selected and then fielded by the Persian army itself.
Yeah, the sight of those pants on the 3 guys remind me the Romans traditionally, it's a later period when the Romans encountered the Persians, but they considered the Persians effeminate because they wore pants.
Yes, the Greeks did the same. The Persians wore pants primarily because they thought it would be better on horseback, and it was easier. It was greater mobility, at least from their perspective. Yes, but the Greeks and the Romans both thought that the wearing of pants was effeminate. Yes. Okay. So the next, we talked about how diverse the Persian military is, but we can make some general statements about the kinds of armor and implements that they used. On the right-hand side, we see a cataphract. The cataphract was an armored cavalry unit. The armor was actually relatively light, considering that it was made so densely. But it was a unit that was originally developed in the steppes of East Asia, Central Asia. It made its way through the Persian Empire and was the dominant cavalry unit in the Persian army. It was because the armor was light enough, the unit was actually quite mobile and could cover a lot of ground. Persians would often use this to either encircle their enemies or to send scouts ahead. You also have archers. If you look at the minifigures, because I couldn't find a good picture of like actual figures, you can see that the front line of soldiers would put down their wicker shields, and then the second line would either fire bows and arrows or fire spears. And those were the saparabara. The saparabara would fire, they would sit in rows and they would fire arrows that would go in a joint formation over the shields and attack the enemy. This was completely different from the Phalanx that we discussed on the Greek side, where you would have spearmen after spearmen standing with their spear over their shield. In this case, after the first line of spear holders and shield defenders, you would have these lines of saparabara. The goal would be to decimate the front line of the enemy while the cataphracts could come in from the sides. Now, in the lower left-hand side is a recreation from 1971, that festival of 2,500 years since the foundation of the Achaemenid Empire. And that was the customary dress of the immortals. You can see they also have wicker shields, and they have the typical square head covering of the Persians. They also come equipped with a shield. You can see that their actual cloaks and defenses are actually quite light to give them mobility and the ability to attack with greater ferocity.
So, Richard, questions. How did they communicate with each other? Your center photo seems to have groups from different areas.
Absolutely. No, between, right, as I said before, the army as a whole did not function as a unit. It functioned where each satrap's soldiers would fight together. And within a satrap, you typically had one common language. Okay. So it could be Persian, but usually it wasn't. It usually was whatever the local language was. For the Ionians under Persian command, for example, they would be speaking Greek. For the Egyptians under Persian command, they'd be speaking Coptic. For the Babylonians, they would be speaking Aramaic. So you had all these different groups, and they would be responding in their own languages, and sort of in this disorganized fashion. And it would only be the satraps themselves or the generals that they appointed who would be communicating in Persian to each other and hearing the main commands of whichever Persian leading general was coordinating the move forward.
Richard, quick. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Joe.
Aramaic was the administrative language of the empire, and that's always been something of a mystery to me. Why? Probably because most merchants spoke Aramaic.
Yes,
something like that. But was Aramaic used by the actual aristocrats at all?
Yes, it was. Aramaic was used by the aristocrats. Persian was a language used by the royal family, and it was the royal family that was primarily at the highest seat of the generaldom, which is why the satraps would communicate with the generals in Persian. But yes, in terms of all paperwork, in terms of organizational documentation, that would be in Aramaic, yes.
Richard, quick question to you.
Sure.
So when Phalanx fought, and and I know if you guys are going to get to this, is obviously the sides were weaker than the middle ground. The middle of the. Was there any particular? I know the cavalry was on the sides for the Phalanx. So was there a particular formation that would be that technical or mechanical, so to speak? The sides would be weaker, and the front would be much stronger, and therefore that formation kind of works.
Well, the Persian response to the phalanx is the sparabara, right? So the phalanx works because you charge it, and then they can hold a unified line, and that way they can repel enemy attacks. But if you have repeated arrow volleys, eventually, right, you'll get the ones in the back, because there are only so many shields that go back. So you're going to it'll force the Spartans to charge, and at that point, you would come in from the back. But then again, I'm not a military tactician. I feel like we have two military tacticians here. I feel like they would have a much better grasp of the tactics that either I described or their own intuitions, because I've only seen bits and pieces.
So
I have a question. Another question. I'm sorry. You go ahead.
So I just wanted to give the floor to Joe and Aaron as far as the tactics of the Phalanx.
I actually wanted to ask a question that related to this before, and my question is: the Phalanx, are the Ionians during the Ionian revolt, what started 499, were they really using proper Phalanx by that time, or it was more on the mainland like Athens and Sparta?
During the Ionian revolt, there were, as far as I can tell, no direct interactions between the Persian soldiers and the Ionian soldiers in what you would call like a typical battle camp where the two sides are facing each other. The Persians were surprised when the Ionians reached Sardis, and when the Persian land forces came, a lot of the Ionians were put to rout. They were just afraid of the Persians, and so the Persians just overtook them as they were running away. So there, as far as I can tell,
there was a battle of Ephesus. When they caught up with them at the Ephesus, and there was a battle of Ephesus. But the Greek army was demoralized at the time. But I know that when the Persians got to the Athens in a battle of Marathon, they were really surprised by the Phalanx tactics. I don't think they expected that, and that's why it leads me to believe that they haven't really encountered during the Ionian revolt proper Phalanx. I'm not sure.
My intuition would match that.
Let me suggest for Ephesus what happened there. The Athenians, and I just looked at this the other day, the Athenians were holding the right side of the line in phalanx formation, but it got rolled up from the other side. And basically it was light forces and cavalry just hit the left flank in effect, and just rolled it up. So they never actually faced an Athenian phalanx because it broke once the flank is cut. They're out.
It was small. It was small. They only had 20 ships. Yes. They sent 20 ships.
And this why they were
confident
at Marathon, because they thought the Athenians would just break again. They actually hadn't encountered a phalanx where they had to attack it head on.
Right. Okay. Greg, to your point, 20 ships at that time, remember, Themistocles did not encounter, went for the rebuilding 300 ships later, at later point. So the 20 ships for that time was a lot of ships.
How many hoplites could they carry?
I know, but I'm just telling you that
have been small
at
armies.
the time, that's all Athens can afford. And also, we are forgetting that Athenians were Ionians; they were not Dorians. So, in fact, they were helping their own people, so to speak. But the 20 ships at the time was a lot of ships that they could afford to give.
Yeah, I meant that the Phalanx was very small.
Athens had more ships. They sent only a portion of their fleet.
Yeah, but Themistocles did not, start the building process up until they found those silver mines.
Right.
And then when he said, listen, he really tricked the Senate to doing it. I don't want to go ahead, but he tricked this,
we're going to do Themistocles' machinations when we talk about Thermopylae. We're going to do that next in 2 weeks.
And Salamis, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's going to be part of the Thermopylae discussion.
So guys, just so you kind of recognize the value in a phalanx is not in a diversified terrain, right? It's in open terrain, and what it allows you to do is think of it as like the heavy infantry then is the equivalent of tanks today, right? That's the armor. It was human armors, and you want to use them kind of at the point of decision, which is kind of like the point you meet the enemy, whatever that is, and then you weaken that, and then use your infantry to sort of overwhelm them. That was sort of that's the theory, and obviously there's an enormous amount of coordination, which is why that's pretty hard to do, and you have to have sort of this luck, so to speak, that you designed it the right way and for the right terrain. And that's why the whole concept of picking kind of your battlefield or the battle space was such a big deal back then, all the way through the Middle Ages, because you sort of had to design your, think of it as like your human warfare machine kind of around the battle that you wanted to have, and then work your way back from there. Obviously, others like Frederick the Great and Napoleon sort of changed that a little. It's a joke, but but back then that was really sort of fundamental, and some of it doesn't change today, right? I mean, it's just the way you're going to employ. You're not going to put tanks in the jungle, right? That never has and never will work. So, they're very terrain dependent. When you have this mix between heavy and light, whatever heavy and light means, you automatically tend to have a very terrain dependent structure at that point, if that makes any sense to you.
Yeah.
No, I'm going to move us on just so we can get to the Ionian Revolt and the battle, actually, of Marathon.
Oh, no, we're not going to get to anything. Don't worry about it.
That's how we roll.
Yeah, exactly. No, so I wanted to show this to show, again, sort of reiterate the Persian perspective that they were the rulers of nations. This is from Nakhshi Rostam, which is the burial place of Darius. And this is actually from his tomb, the inscription, and like, his tomb is actually in sort of like the Valley of the Kings kind of thing, where it's on the side of a cliff face. And so the cliff was actually carved. And this is actually one of the carvings from the cliff. And you can see all of the nations represented at his burial. That's sort of the idea. And it goes across, from the Persians and the Medes and the Elamites and so forth and so on, all in their unique styles of clothing, all in their different styles of dress, but all together holding up the empire. And that was sort of the idea. It included, you could see in the lower center right-ish is the Ionians, right? The Ionians were also a nation of Darius's, just like every other nation. So it was sort of this idea that all of these nations supported the King of Kings and were part of this almost celestial empire. Now, One part that we sort of haven't discussed yet a little bit is the Persian religion of Zoroastrianism. And so Zoroastrianism, some people call it monotheism. I sort of struggle with that. In the religion, you have a supreme god called Ahura Mazda, and Ahura Mazda was the creator of all good in the world. But unfortunately, there are demons beyond his power, led by the Angra Mainyu, who is the most powerful demon. And Angra Mainyu and Ahura Mazda do not have the power to destroy each other, but they do have the power to battle. And so the world is split between the forces of Angra Mainyu, and which are the evil forces, and those of Ahura Mazda, which are the good forces. And the symbol of Ahura Mazda is this idea that Ahura Mazda brings light out of the darkness, right? That Angra Mainyu is trying to cover everything in darkness, and Ahura Mazda, through his creation, is trying to bring out the light. And the best way to bring out the light from the darkness is through fire, right? So fire became a worshipped symbol of Ahura Mazda. Now, of course, the Zoroastrians would say they don't worship the fire is a symbol, and it reflects their worship of Ahura Mazda, who creates the fire, who takes light out, who brings light from the darkness. And so the two Persian symbols became the fire, representative of Ahura Mazda, this idea of removing the darkness and bringing civilization, and water, this ability to control the earth and to make it in the shape of the Persian Empire, to bring civilization. So the fire and the water became the two symbols of Persia. And when these various nations would send their representatives to Persepolis, they would bring with them fire and water to represent that they were part of this Persian experiment. They were bringing light from the darkness, and that they were going to be part of the building of this empire.
Now, was this belief all the way up until the Islamic Islam?
Yes, yes, very much so. There were periods of wax and wane. During the Seleucid Empire, right, there was a large Hellenic influence, and so the belief in Zoroastrianism sort of decreased. But after the Seleucids gave way to the Parthians, and then the Parthians to the Sasanians, belief in Zoroastrianism actually became more and more fundamentalist as the years dragged on. By the end of the Sasanian Empire, religions other than Zoroastrianism were banned within the Iranian Empire, with the exception of certain forms of Christianity that could not be connected to Rome, like the Assyrian Church. But generally speaking, Zoroastrianism in this period was much more open than it was in the later periods. When Islam came, Zoroastrianism was considered Ahl al-Kitab, people of the book, even though the Quran does not specify Zoroastrianism as a religion that would be acceptable as people of the book, right? That's Jews and Christians and Sabians usually. But since Zoroastrians were so numerous in Iran, they couldn't but accept them as people of the book, because otherwise they would have to like decimate the entire Iranian population. It wouldn't work. But between the conquest period, Iran fell in 638 CE, between 638 and 641, and the early 1000s. The number of Zoroastrians slowly declined, and the number of Muslims slowly increased, such that by the year 1000, 1100, the majority of the Iranian population was Muslim. They were actually Sunni Muslims at this point, not Shiites. That would happen later.
I wanted to make a comment about Zoroastrianism that now read an article recently about basically a non-believer from the United States who went to India on a mission and with a group, and was led to different places of worship where they continue to worship Zoroastrianism.
Yeah, no, one of the things during the Islamic period is that a lot of Zoroastrians who wanted to preserve their faith fled to India, where they were identified as the Parsis, right? Because they come from Persia. So they were identified as the Parsi community. And to this day, the largest Zoroastrian community is the one that's in India. It's about 75,000 people. Although that number is probably dwindling because Parsis only marry other Parsis.
Right.
Do we know why Persia was one of the few Islamic countries that didn't accept Arabic as a spoken language? Do we know?
No, that's actually completely false. There was a full attempt to replace the Persian language with Arabic. The reason it failed was because of political struggles within the caliphate. No, but this is a very common perception that Persian was
Arabic is not spoken in Tehran today.
Correct.
That was my point.
Oh, sure.
They accepted the script,
you could also say that Arabic isn't spoken in Georgia, and it's not spoken in Turkey, and it's not spoken in Uzbekistan. The reason why Arabic replaced all the languages otherwise in the Middle East, like it replaced the Egyptian languages, it replaced all the Aramaic and Judaic languages, it replaced the languages in Syria, like Elamite, Eblite, I meant. The reason it replaced all these languages is because those areas remained under Arab rule for centuries. The Tawhidid dynasty in 810 cut off Iran from increasing Arabization, although the Tawhidids themselves continued to speak Arabic. It was then the Buyids who took power from the Tawhidids in the 860s, and the Safavids who took power from the Buyids about 100 years later, who instituted an increasing re-Persianification of the country. And so Arabic was downgraded from being the language of administration to just being a liturgical language and a spiritual language, and Persian was reinstated as the language of administration, as it had been during the Sasanian period. So it was not that the Persian Empire didn't start speaking Arabic, it's that because the Tawhidids cut it off from the Arab rulers only 150 years after the conquest, it didn't have time to completely Arabize. But if the Tawhidids hadn't come up in the 810s, I feel that by 900 or 950, the Persian language would be a dead language.
The script, they picked the Arabic script, right?
Yeah, they took the Arabic script, but
how is that? Why didn't they reestablish the Persian?
Because by this point, most people who were literate in the Arabic script, so it was just easier to use it.
But also, Richard, and obviously you'll do a Turkic Empire, which thank you for signing in for it. But when the Turkics came to the region, they used Farsi.
Correct.
Which is weird, right?
No. It's that makes perfect sense. By the time that the Seljuks invaded Iran, the Iranian aristocracy had been speaking Persian for 100 years, right? The Safavids invaded in the 900s. The Seljuks invaded in 1010 in the Battle of Dandan Khan. So by that time, almost all the aristocracy was Persian speaking. And the Turks considered Persian a more elevated language than Turkish. So for them, it made perfect sense to administer affairs in Persian.
That was more generally true. It's little known in the West. Persian became the high language in all of Central Asia, even down into, with the arrival of the Mughals. They used Persian as the high language for literature in northern India. So
absolutely, and a lot of Indian political positions that were established under the Mughals, which continue into the present day, take their terms from Persian, like Nawab, which is a deputy, specifically because that was the Persian word for it, and the Persian word Nawab came from the Arabic Nawab. But anyway, we can go to the next slide.
So this is what was at stake and what the Greeks saw as a threat here. And I will kind of like temper down freedom versus slavery. I'd say that it was more not that they were going to be enslaved, but more about we're not going to have the right to practice our own kind of governance and the way that we're going to be able to move forward. There was the fear of that. Now, Richard did just touch on, concepts of monotheism and not really in line with that. For the Greeks, they did see that Ahura Mazda and the worship of just this one entity, if you will, was a threat to their polytheistic pantheon of gods and all. There was a fear of not being able to practice or experiment with democracy, that they would be subsumed under this larger empire that had more of a roll up to the King of Kings. They didn't want that. They wanted that freedom from political from external political rule, and also it actually should say secure borders from the Persian Empire, not for the Persian Empire, but from the Persian Empire. So just getting a little bit more of some kind of a distance from the Persian Empire. So it kind of illustrates what was something that caused unrest within the Greek mindset was an inscription that's found on some tablets at Persepolis written by Xerxes, and it's called the Diva inscription.
Yeah, the Diva.
The Diva inscription, and the quote is, "Among these countries there was a place where previously demons had been worshipped. Afterwards there I worshipped Ahura Mazda in accordance with truth reverently." So Greeks saw this as a threat to their practice of religion, and that their gods were seen as demons, which Richard had just spoken about.
Yeah, exactly. That was one of the reasons why, for example, when the Persians marched, they would often have a column of fire at the front of the column, representing that they were bringing light to the darkness. That the people in front of them were worshiping the demons subject to Angra Mainyu, and were therefore uncivilized people. They were the people bringing evil into the world, and the Persian advance would bring the light of the civilization to them. They would then come to worship Ahura Mazda, either directly, but more likely indirectly by being part of this Persian experiment and offering fire and water when they were approached.
Okay. Moving on then to kind of the tipping point, the buildup that's happening along this, again, the western coast of what is today now Turkey, was Ionia at the time, and it's the Ionian Revolt. And this occurred for about a 5-year period between 499 and 494 BCE. In the orange areas, you see that's the extent of what was actually revolting against Persian rule. And battles are listed here in the black. The red triangles list those that actually participated in the resistance to Persia and the revolt within Ionia here. Again, I think that, we did already touch on a bit about the religion. People were worried about Darius expanding into Greece and gaining more territory, no longer wanting to be ruled by a foreign entity. We briefly touched on this, but I do want to call it to attention because it was important to the Ionians. If you think about where they are positioned, they were the ultimate middlemen, in terms of commerce and free enterprise and the exchange of goods and services. So they were making money at this time, and under the Persian umbrella, this was infringed upon, and so their economic livelihood and the way that they practiced free enterprise was now more restricted, and the Ionians did not like that. And then lastly, the freedom from, again, from political oversights and the ability to be self-deterministic in their own rule. Those were the key points that led to the Ionians revolting.
Yeah, let's keep going. So now, from the Persian perspective, the Ionian issue was a local issue in Anatolia. For him, the Greek islands, the Peloponnesos, the Attica, Boeotia, all of these regions, to him were irrelevant. They were just sort of colonies upon rocks. They couldn't deliver the kind of wealth, for example, of a Lydia, right? So from an administrative point of view, he sort of saw them as a periphery and not really worth much attention. And so the cultural issues that the Ionians took as a problem were just, like, to him, they didn't even register as an issue, because that sort of cultural independence, that desire for increased autonomy in economic affairs, it didn't make sense. You would make more money within the Persian Empire this way if it was administered as a holistic entity. And the Persians generally had a policy of treating the nations that they conquered relatively well, and so they expected that those nations would be part of the Persian experiment in return, right? Good treatment would beget good treatment. So the failure to respect Persian authority by the Ionians was seen as a rejection of this Persian experiment. That was the part that was angering to the Persians. You're part of the empire, you should behave like part of the empire. We're treating you well enough to do so. Now, when the Achaemenids took power in the various areas of the empire, they replaced the previous Ionian kings who had, or the previous Ionian tyrants, depending on the city-state, with tyrants of their own choosing. And one of these was Histiaeus. Histiaeus of Miletus was chosen by the Achaemenids, but at first, but then they came not to trust him. They thought that he was fomenting more of this anger towards Persian rule. So he decided to replace Histiaeus with Aristagoras, who was his, I believe, his nephew, who was definitely a family member. And because Persians had a high respect for family integrity, right? They were ruling as a royal house. And so Aristagoras ruled Miletus, and Histiaeus was deported to Susa, right? Susa, we mentioned, is all the way in Persia. It's that capital city, because Darius did not want did not want Histiaeus anywhere close to the situation in Miletus. But from the Greek side, we're aware, and the Persians suspected as much, that Histiaeus provided secret instructions to Aristagoras to foment a rebellion because of the direct Persian interference in Miletus. Now, in this picture, you can see the city of Sardis, or what's left of the city of Sardis in modern Turkey. Sardis was the capital of Lydia at the time, and was one of the wealthier places in the Persian Empire within Anatolia. It was very important to the Persians, and was their administrative city as well in the region. We can go to the next slide. Just load everything. Yeah. All right. So this is a picture of, it's a modern painting of the burning of Sardis. So from the Persian perspective, the fact that there was a revolt in Ionia where they marched for 3 days in the night and surprised the city of Sardis and put the whole thing to fire was inhuman and indecent, right? This was a corruption of the use of fire. Fire was a light bringer. Fire was not a destroyer. And to use fire this way was both a religious indignity and also a clearly political indignity by putting to fire the great wealth of the Persian Empire, right? You were attacking the primary way that the empire sustained itself. And the fact that it was set ablaze, that people were stolen from, and that things were looted, the Persians had a very negative reaction to this. This to them read like terrorism. Among the things that was burnt was the Phrygian temple of Cybele. Now, the Persians, while not believing in the gods of others, had an immense amount of respect for the holy places and sacred places of other religions. So the destruction of the temple of Cybele was also considered a major violation of the sanctity that these kinds of places would have. So, but the destruction of Sardis through the burning led to Ionia being independent or quasi-independent, especially those Ionian states that were headquartered in the islands. So Darius had to assemble a navy, and this was a huge change from previous Persian policy because Persians did not historically have navies. And he had to argue with a number of his chief administrators that a navy was necessary. And so he talked to the satraps of Egypt, Phoenicia, and Cilicia in order to get a navy together. And the Cilician component was actually a contingent of pirate ships. So it wasn't even a proper navy from Cilicia anyway. But he got this set of 600 ships together and sailed on Ionia. Because even if the cities of Ionia were based on the land, they had open access to the sea. So the Greek city-states, especially in the Cyclades and in the Dodecanesos, those islands between Greece and Turkey, though they could keep resupplying them from the sea. So a land siege would not work. It needed to be sea warfare. In addition to sending this 600-boat navy to the Aegean, Darius sent a message to all of the Ionia saying he didn't want to go to war. He wanted the reestablishment of the empire. The right thing to do would be to submit. And if any Ionian city that submitted back to the Persian Empire would be treated completely fairly with no hostility in the future. No Ionian city-state took the offer, though. And so you had the Greek city-states of Ionia unifying together in sort of a piecemeal navy that didn't have a unified direction at the Battle of Lade, which was a huge Persian naval victory. And because of the participation of the Athenians and the Erythraeans in the burning of Sardis and the Ionian revolt overall, Athens and Eritrea earned a black mark in the Persian eyes. They had actively assisted a rebellion when Darius had never threatened Athens. He never threatened Eritrea. There was no reason, in his view, for those city-states to have fought in this war. And so he swore vengeance upon them.
Comment on the Eritreans.
Yeah.
This goes back to stuff that we talked about in earlier discussions. This actually goes back to the Lillantine War, where the Eritreans, they're on the island of Euboea, and in the Lillantine War, we're talking the end of the 8th century, they received reinforcements from Miletus. So their support of Miletus, Herodotus makes the point that this was the Eritreans basically feeling that they were honor bound to go and support the Milesians when they were attacked, because the Milesians supported them in their war against Chalcis in the Lillantine War. So what goes around comes around. And this fact in this statement in Herodotus is really one of the primary points for scholars to reconstruct the Lillantine War. It's like a starting point for analysis of what actually happened in the Lillantine War.
Wow, nice.
And,
all right, let's go.
Can I add a comment about Athens?
Sure.
Because what happened there is when Cleomenes was advancing to Athens, they actually asked for support from Persian Empire. They sent the people to Sardis, and they said that they demanded earth and water in return, and also said that they should reestablish Hippias. So they refused. Once they refused, because that means submission, earth and water. Once they refused, they were already in the state of war with Persia. So when Aristogoras asked for help, that was one of the reasons why they were already in the state of war with Persia. So they also just went, and of course they claimed Ionian roots and all that stuff.
Right, exactly. And you can see that the things that the Persians demanded perfectly matched their perception of reality, right? The fire and the water, because they were going to be part of the empire, and the accepting of the tyrant, because that was the way that the Persians established law and order, was that they created a unified satrap system with an administrative center based on the rule of somebody that they trusted, and they trusted Hippias as being a turncoat local who would understand the region, but also be loyal to the Persians. So this fits exactly into their empire building scheme. So we can go to the next slide.
Hey, Richard, before you start, may I ask a question?
Yeah, sure.
So just take a step back. I just want to make sure I understand going forward. So the Ionian Greeks wanted independence, and then they marched 3 days over to Sardis and burned Sardis down, which is a Lydian city.
Correct.
What's the military advantage that helps them gain their independence by burning Sardis? Because
Sardis was the administrative capital, so they figured that if there would be any Persian resistance, it would be based in Sardis.
Yeah. Okay. It's a satrap was in Sardis.
And destroying Sardis actually did get them their independence. Right, Ionia was independent for 6 years, between 499 and 490.
The Greeks were aggressive.
499 and 494.
The Greeks were aggressive and greedy and never really separated, trade from piracy and things like that. So the Greeks were egregious. The Greeks would go in, and so there was no real necessarily strategic purpose or intent to burning Sardis. They were there, and they said, we've conquered this place, everything they got is ours, let's put it to the torch. You know, that's just kind of the way they were.
Yeah.
Some historians believe it was accidental, the fire, from what I read. Some historians believe that the fire was an accident and then it just spread.
And
last question, we got to get to the battle. So
I'll go quick. In the overall war with Persia, was this just sort of one little skirmish or big skirmish, or was this part of the overall Greek-Persian dynamic of this overall war?
Well, the Ionian revolt really sets the stage from the Persian perspective of why they, for want of a better term, give a shit about Greece. Because from the Persian perspective, the Greek city-states were not major wealth generation points. They didn't have access to other lucrative states. It's not like, for example, Babylonia sits between Persia and Egypt, right? And so you need to take Babylonia in order to get there, or Phoenicia to get there. So from their perspective, there was no real benefit to taking Greece. And so there was not really any military expenditure to expand in that direction. Darius and Xerxes wanted to expand much more to the east. India was wealthy, right? That was an empire worth taking. Or expanding into the Caucasus. A lot of those kingdoms had mineral wealth. So that's where they wanted to spend their time. Greece was sort of a non-issue, but because of the Ionian revolt and because they had done such a sacrilege in the way that they treated the Persian Empire, Darius wanted them to feel the full weight and power of this empire that they had awoken.
I mean, they had humiliated the Persians.
Yeah,
and Persians had the prestige at stake. They had to respond.
Yeah, I would say the best sort of modern equivalent would be September 11th. I think it's a little strong, but that's sort of the perception from the Persian Empire, right? Afghanistan is an irrelevant place to most Americans, but the fact that people came from there and did such a horrible thing on our soil meant that a lot of Americans felt that we had a need to go back there and punish them.
I think that's a great comparison.
Okay, I'm going to skip this one because Richard actually just covered everything on this slide. So let's
Brilliant.
move
So
it
then
on.
it's back to me
Nice
again.
thinking.
So we have the March of Mardonius. Now Mardonius is a very interesting person. His father Gobrias was a Persian nobleman who had worked with King Darius when he came to power. As Greg mentioned, there was some succession issues that Darius had when he came to power, and Gobrias was able to overthrow the prior king. I think it was Bactria. And so Gobrias wanted to cement his relationship with Darius through marriage. So Darius married Gobrias's daughter, and Gobrias married Darius's sister. So they both married each other's relatives. And Mardonius also married Darius's daughter Artaxerxes. So because of this, Mardonius and Darius the Great had the situation where Darius the Great was Mardonius' uncle, Mardonius' father-in-law, and his half-brother-in-law all at the same time. So you can see how close the familial relationship was. And he was chosen as the general to lead the Ionian revolt. Yes. So Mardonius was involved in the Ionian revolt on the land side. He managed to solve it. And so he had further trust from Darius to lead the attack on the country. So the first thing that he did is that he organized a parallel march over the land and the sea. And you can see in this map, there's the green lines that follow the coast in Thrace, and the green lines that are in the water, also following the coast in Thrace, right? You can see these two parallel green lines that walk across each other. As Mardonius marched across Thrace, he had this navy that had been assembled. He sent it up along the coast, right? It had won the Battle of Lade, which is close to Miletus, in the southern part of Anatolia. They come up and over. And so as Mardonius marched overland, every Thracian city that he came to offered him the fire and water, indicating that they surrendered. And he treated those cities relatively well. Then the Navy came to Mount Athos. You can see the promontory, right, that we saw before, that the Chalkidiki has the three lines into the sea, the three peninsulas into the sea. The easternmost is Mount Athos, and the winds across Mount Athos are very severe. So when the ships came, there was a particularly strong storm, and the entire Persian Navy was sunk. This was sorry.
Is there any way to make this image bigger? Because I think I really would like to follow what Richard's saying, but it's
yes.
really hard to see the map.
Wait. Yeah, sure. How are you using? Oh, perfect. Yeah. Zoom, pull up. Pull up. Okay. You can see that in the edge of the orange area, where the orange meets the yellow, if you look slightly to the lower.
Oh, sorry.
Right,
sorry.
No. You're in the right part. Keep zooming. You can. Okay, I guess that's as close as it goes. So, okay, you can see where the yellow meets the orange. If you look to the lower right-hand side of that, you can see the Chalkidiki, which sort of looks like a head with two arms and a head and a smaller head sticking out. Exactly that, where the cursor is pointing. If you look on the right-hand side of the three, you see exactly there is Mount Athos. Mount Athos today is a Greek monastery, but at that time it was just a mountain, and the Greeks considered it a very holy place, the same way that they considered Mount Olympus, as a holy place. And it was considered holy because the winds that blew over this mountain were so numerous that it was considered like the gods were speaking. And of course, the Persians didn't know this history, and the sailors that they had brought with them didn't know this history, right? Because they brought Cilicians, Phoenicians, and Egyptians. So this is not their waters. They came across and around the edge of Mount Athos, and the wind came down and destroyed the entire Persian fleet. At this point, the Thracians start revolting, and Mardonius himself is forced to retreat from Thrace, and he only left small garrisons in that area. So this was seen as a massive Persian defeat, this loss of this 600 boat navy, and because of this, Darius was fully angered and incensed that Greece couldn't even be attacked, and he relieved Mardonius of his command. So then we can go to the next slide.
Richard, why did they go up like that to the north? Why didn't they just go across and smash Athens?
Sure.
Is it
that's what they're going to do next. But you have to remember, the Persians are a land force. They feel much more comfortable on the land. So this idea of following the land, taking Thrace, then taking Thessalia, then moving into Boeotia, and then into Attica, right? This whole sort of counterclockwise motion on land to them felt much more natural. That they knew how to do. And Mardonius's previous experiences in war were on land as well. So that was sort of his mental calculus.
I mean, this was also the nature of Mediterranean and Aegean navigation throughout this whole period. I mean, to go straight out across the ocean, you didn't really do that, or the sea. It was very, very dangerous. You didn't, and so the way that people traveled was to hug the coast.
Exactly.
You didn't want to be out of sight of land ever.
The other major difference between shipping today and shipping in that period was that boats typically did not have large reserves of foodstuffs on board. So typically what would happen is that you could sail the distance you could sail in one day, and then you would come up on shore, and then you would sleep on land. Even when you had battles, for example, that were close to the seashore and people retreated to their ships, at night, they would come back out of their ships and make camp on land.
And you almost want to think of a lot of their ships as these kind of funky classifications. Like they almost had the equivalent of like infantry, like in World War II, like the LTVs, like basically like infantry landing ships, boats almost, the boat, boat and a ship. And then they had these logistics ships, which had a little kind of, let's say, they were basically the better design, right? They had actually closer to normal hulls, and then you had these like funky, like almost like micro battleships that would throw fire and oil at each other and you know, try to be at a distance that they could, you know, almost fight from a standoff. I mean, so it was really in a lot of ways they were almost like figuring out how you used water and this ship construction process to sort of survive first and then somehow get somewhere else that you didn't get over land. So it was still very primitive that way, you know, in comparison to what people understood on land.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's right.
Yeah. Can I add one more detail? That during those skirmishes in Thrace, Mardonius was wounded, and that's why he was relieved from the persecution of the actions. He didn't participate with the rest of the war.
Yeah.
Otherwise, he would have been. Yeah.
I don't know if it was just the injury alone that took him out of commission. I think Darius was also quite angry with the loss of this many ships.
Yeah, that could be too. But they used that for as an official.
I mean, the thing is that Mardonius was put back into the field by Xerxes. So it's not like, so I think it was a Darius personality issue as well. How could my blood do this? So anyway, next slide. Yeah, so we're on the campaign of Artaphernes. So Datis and Artaphernes inherited the command structure from Mardonius after, and by the way, Mardonius's Persian name is Mardunia. We don't know the Persian names of Datis and Artaphernes, which are clearly Greek names. It's probably something like Artaphernia, or if it is in Persian, but it looks like a Greek structure anyway, in terms of the name. And they decide to do what Anne suggests, which is to cut across the Mediterranean. So the first thing that they do is they arrive at the island of Naxos. If you zoom into the map on the lower side, yeah, exactly. Perfect. You can see this sort of brown line that starts at Samos, the island of Samos, and sort of goes down to the island of Naxos. So they took the island of Naxos and they proceeded to island hop throughout the Kyklades, the Cyclade Islands. And every time that they took one of these islands, of course, the islands would submit because the Persian army was just that massive. And then they moved to Euboea, the island on which Eretria sits. They besieged the city for 5 days. And then people in Eretria opened the gates and loyalists to the Persians, right? Because you remember the Medaizers were part of the Greek population. A lot of people were willing to accept Persian rule, and some in Eritrea were as well. But Darius was so angry because of Eritrea's participation in the Ionian revolt that he deported the entire city of Eritrea to Susa. And Herodotus actually recounts that when he went to Susa, he met some of the descendants of these deported Eritreans who were still living in Persia. And the city then was razed, and there was nothing left. So then Datis and Artaphernes decided to use Euboea as a launching point for their attack on Athens, which, go to the next slide. Yeah, so here you can sort of see a clearer map of the attack on Euboea, right? So they arrive on the island and they actually go around the city. So the Persians are approaching the city of Eretria, not from the sea, but from the land. As I pointed out, a column of Eritrean nobles betrayed the city for the Persians. And Arderica is the name of the actual town near Susa, where the Eritreans were deported. And we can go to the next slide.
Okay. And this actually is where we start to talk about the Battle of Marathon. Woohoo! And I want to do a time check though, because it's after 11 a.m. in California. And I just want to know if we should pause or continue the discussion.
I think you should continue because we can't stop here now.
Can't stop you. It's had all this buildup.
I know.
How much
we're just
left?
so excited.
How much left?
I think the rest of the presentation is going to be 30, 45 minutes. I don't think it's going to be that much more.
Yeah.
That's what I kept saying, guys.
Okay.
Yeah, but the difference, Aaron, is that 30-40 minutes Aaron time is like 3 hours for the rest of us.
That's fair. That's fair.
Yeah. And so one thing to note as well is that this is recorded, so folks can just pop on. If you have to drop, we have the last half hour that will be recorded and available to you. Okay. So let's go ahead and before we even get to the Battle of Marathon, though, we do have this one thing just to quickly talk about. And as Richard was talking about, the movement of Darius and all coming into Greece, right? We have actually the first line that's attempted to be held by the Greeks, and it's called Tempe Gorge. And we don't talk about it very much because there really wasn't any kind of a battle or any kind of an engagement, but it was their first attempt. And the people that were there that were leading it was actually Themistocles, who we know is the Athenian naval commander from the Battle of Artemisium, and he did a lot more that we'll talk about later. As well as the Spartan Unitas, they marched 10,000 troops to hold that line. Now, if you remember, again, this is a Persian vassal state, and this is a Persian ally. So they're in a very, very precarious situation by staying at that particular location. One of the things that I did read about was the king of Macedon at the time, King Alexander I. He was a Persian ally, a Persian supporter. However, having hosted the Persians for a number of weeks, he quickly grew tired of them because he had to spend so much time and energy and resources supporting and hosting them at a very elevated level that he actually went to Tempe Gorge, or sent some people to talk to Themistocles and Unitas and advocate for they just breaking the line and moving away so that the Persians could continue south and he would be rid of them and wouldn't have to support them anymore. And Themistocles, just really quick, his strategy overall when it comes to the Greeks, from the Greeks fighting against the Persians, was we don't have the land troops, the hoplites, to counter their vast numbers and their superiority in numbers. We need to really focus on confronting them by sea. That's where we can be the strongest. He believed that a sacrifice of land was worth it, that in the end the Greeks could prevail if they really focused on confronting by sea. Obviously, he is sent, agrees to go north to Tempe Gorge, so he's not supported, and he's one of the leaders that goes to the north, Tempe. The lead up to actually our Battle of Marathon is, it takes place in 490 BCE, post-Ionian revolt. We talked about Eretria, so I'm not going to rehash that again. But the Persians have stationed themselves off the coast, or off in the Bay of Marathon. And when we look at the Bay of Marathon, we'll be able to see a bit more that it's a much more protected place. They've already lost a lot of their fleets by storms, and the Bay of Marathon is protected. So it's an important piece of information. At this time, we have the introduction of the runner Phidippides, who has made marathons throughout the world really famous. And before he actually runs, quote, a marathon, he is sent from Athens to Sparta, begging the Spartans for help to come and defend Marathon from the Persians. He runs down to Sparta. He gets the information that the Spartans will help, but they are not going to show for the Battle of Marathon. Again, because they are engaged in one of their religious festivals, which is really important to them, and that takes precedence over even helping others if there's any kind of a conflict that's happening. Phidippides is going to return to Sparta with that message, to Athens with the message that the Spartans will be there, but they are delayed. And Richard, are you there to talk about the pincher?
Yes, I'm here, sorry. So the Persian thought process we only have from the Greek side. So this is mostly guesswork. But one of the interesting things is that there's a Byzantine document called the Suda, which was designed to discuss different terms that were common usage in the Byzantine Greek world. And one of the expressions that they use is called chorosipes, which means the horses are away. And this is a story that during the Battle of Marathon, the Ionians in the Persian army, because remember, the Persian army includes people from all across the empire, right? Everybody's responsible for building this. And so Ionians were part of the Persian army. Some of them were turncoats to the Persians and used and signaled in Greek this chorosipes to the Athenian forces marshaled at Marathon. So the chorosipes meant that the Persian army had put their cavalry back on horses and was sending it around to Athens. And so Miltiades, who was leading the Athenian troops, understood this expression and knew that the forces at Marathon would be cavalryless because the forces would be coming around to Athens. And he also knew that after the defeat, that he had to deal with the Persian forces at Marathon immediately, because he would have to be ready to defend Athens from this cavalry onslaught if that would have come very soon. So it seems that if this was the case, that the Persian attempt was to put people at Marathon to distract the Athenian guards, which would defend that area, and that presumably turncoats within Athens, people who would be Medeisers, would open the doors of Athens, the cavalry would march in, and they would take the city without much resistance, right? Because they would want, and they would put Hippias on the throne, which was their original intent. So this is the idea, that the Persians would sort of create a pincer movement where they had the troops on land that they thought they could handle. Perhaps the Athenians, maybe they could, maybe they couldn't. But the dominant attack would be the cavalry attack at Athens with the Athenian troops in Marathon unable to respond. Okay. We can go to the next slide.
So the location and geography that we're talking about here, and it's not a fantastic map, I have to say, but we'll have better ones. So you've got the Bay of Marathon.
The map of Marathon, yeah.
The map of Marathon. So you have here the Persian fleet that is stationed during the actual battle. This is the Bay of Marathon. It is nicely protected. I think a couple of things to note are that there are marshlands, which are going to be extremely difficult and prove actually to be the death of folks. The marshlands are on either side. The Greeks also have felled trees to set a better line of protection against the Persians. The Persians are here, and it's Datis or Datis that it has about how many? I think there's 30,000 that are there. And then the Greeks, we have about 10,000 that are under Miltiades that are in location there. The battle site was suggested actually by Hippias, who again is aligned with the Persians because he knew that was a great place for the fleet to be protected from the winds. This is an image of what Marathon looks like today. So you see that there's mountains in the background, and then you do have more of a plain type of an environment, and then you've got this marshland.
If I can add, one of the difficulties with the marshland is that it would force the Persian soldiers to only occupy that stretch of beach that wasn't marshy, because being in a marsh would hinder your movement. And one of the real advantages of the light armor of the Persians was that they could move more nimbly than the Greeks.
Yeah. So the folks that are actually at the Marathon, we have Athenians, but we also have a contingent of about 600 to 1,000 volunteers from Plataea. A total of 10,000 troops. The key people that are leading at Marathon for the Greeks are Callimachus, that is the Athenian war archon, and then Miltiades, the Athenian commander. Now, Miltiades does have experience and information on how the Persians operate in general, because he had been a part of, I think, one of their battles with the Scythians, and also had that experience. On the Persian side, there are about 30,000 troops. Leader Datis Artaphernes, the Persian commander, and then of course Hippias. One thing I wanted to call out, though, I thought was pretty cool, is that this is an image of the helmet of Miltiades, and you can see again like how much coverage there is around the total, like you know, the ear area, the eye area, the facial area, and how limited you would be in terms of being able to hear as well as to see on the periphery. We know that it's the helmet of Miltiades because it's found at Marathon, and it's inscribed with Miltiades dedicated it to Zeus. The first part of the Battle of Marathon isn't really much of a battle, and it's just a waiting game. The Persians, as Richard had mentioned, they're awaiting some kind of a signal that will let them know that those that are within Athens and willing to betray the Athenian city will flash a signal atop the Mount Penteli, and also they're waiting for that. They want to know that we're good to go on the in Athens. And for the Greeks and Plataeans are really hoping that the Spartans are going to show up and offer some reinforcements there. They've got about 2 to 3 miles of line space that are separating them. The stalemate is broken on August 12th, and Richard, you can interject at any time, but I understand that Datis sails for Athens in the middle of the night from the Bay of Marathon, and that's about an 8 to 10 hour voyage to get down to Athens.
Exactly right.
Okay, and then Richard touched on this, that the Ionians that are in the Persian camp, they have offered information to the Athenians at Marathon and letting them know about the strategy and what's really going on. So now the Athenians there know that there's a counterattack that's happening, or a pincer attack that's happening in Athens, or planned to happen in Athens.
A quick question, if you don't mind.
Yes.
Maybe this goes to Richard as well. So the fact that the Persians are a land power, the Greeks, the Athenians are more of a sea power. Was there scope for the Athenian navy to interdict the Persian supplies via the ocean? To what extent were the Persians vulnerable to that?
I don't know. I will pass on that question.
I mean, I don't believe that I believe the naval force of the Persians was much larger than what the Athenians could fight by themselves.
Yeah,
and with such little notice.
The development of the Athenian navy comes in the succeeding 10 years.
When they've struck the silver mine.
That's right.
Right,
That's
to pay for it.
Were not the sort of major power on sea that they were 10 years later.
Okay, thank you.
And armies at that time, you know, they could do quite well just by, by commandeering whatever food and stuff they found around places where they were operating. They would
in terms of
operating in places where there were no food available.
Yeah.
Did they just sail after the battle?
They did sail to Athens. They reached Athens.
We're going to sailed. He sailed from Marathon around Attica. Did it happen after the battle or before?
The finishing of okay, so in the timeline, the horses go away, and they start sailing around. In that 8 to 10 hour period, the Battle of Marathon happens. Then then Miltiades retreats to Athens, and by the time that the horses and the boats carrying them arrive at Athens, Miltiades is at Athens.
Right. So they made it within that period. So they sailed before the battle, right? So that's
they set sail before the battle, and they arrived in Athens long after the battle.
So that probably precipitated the battle. That's why Athenians attacked, right?
Exactly right. Yes.
I see.
Right. So they have knowledge, but we also have Artaphernes, who's still at the Battle of Marathon site, right? So they've kind of split into two pincer they've tried to sandwich basically Athens in a way. The Athenians, correct. But Miltiades and Callimachus have that information, and they know that they've got to get an attack on, and they have to get back to Athens, just as Richard was saying there. And you know, Athens is largely undefended. There may be some people that are left behind to do some kind of defense, but certainly it's not an effective hoplite force that could stop the Persians and the cavalry from coming into the city.
There are no walls at that time, right? Athens had no walls at the time, right? I think
that I don't
was
know.
Later.
So
that
that's
I don't know, but
yeah, I don't know that's true or not. But there is in some of the literature that I was reading that they do talk about opening the gates.
The gates, yeah.
So I don't know if yeah, exactly what gates those are. I do not know, but to me that I have an image of some kind of reinforcement where there are some areas that may be protected behind like gates. I don't know if anybody else has information.
Yeah, my intuition is that the Acropolis and areas surrounding the Acropolis were protected by a small wall. I don't think the entire city of Athens was protected by a wall. I mean, that would be my intuition.
In fact, walls kind of defined your existence as a city. If you didn't have walls, then you were not a city. You had to have,
because I know that Eritrea was besieged for 6 days.
Right.
So it did have a big wall, so they couldn't.
Right, but the
reason they opened the gates. The sympathizers of opened the gates. That's how they took Eritrea.
Right, exactly. But the thought process was that Hippias already knew people inside of the city.
Right.
So as soon as Hippias would
they could have.
Right. So as soon as Hippias would land on shore, those people would open the gates. The Persian cavalry would march in. Athens would be forced to submit, and it would become the next state in the Persian Empire. That was the Persian thought process. What they weren't expecting is to have to fight from the coastline to get to Athens, to fight through Piraeus.
And so the strategy from the Greek point of view, from the Athenian point of view, is that the Athenians, and we'll see an image of this, are going to concentrate on the wings where the Persians are weaker traditionally. Sorry?
We're talking about at Marathon now, yeah.
At Marathon, correct. And they're also going to entice the Persians to break through in the center of their formation to kind of get them in a double pincher move. Now, some of the literature I was reading had this as, was it strategy versus necessity? And so I'm not really 100% sure on that, if this was really strategic in nature or if it was just the way that the Athenians, because of their numbers, had to align themselves because of their numbers. So the actual engagement, this is actually from some educational website, and I like visuals, so I went ahead and grabbed this here. Is you've got the Bay of Marathon, you've got the fleet here, you've got Persians that are pretty consistent, as we understand it, in terms of their formation all the way across. You've got the Greeks here with the stronger forces on the flanks and the smaller numbers actually in the middle there. You've got the marshlands, which are going to prove fatal later on in the stories. And I think that what I was reading was that the Greeks were about 8 deep on the flanks and 4 deep in the middle. The first part of the engagement is that the Persians successfully push the Greeks back because they're weaker, and on the outside, you have the Greeks are pushing the Persians on their flanks there. And there are, I believe, some cavalry that still remain, but the numbers are extremely low, is what I recall.
That's correct.
From that. And in the middle, I believe, is where we have some archers on the Persian side. Is that, yep, okay. We then have the Persians break formation on the flanks, and what they're doing is they're going towards their ships here so that they can get away. They continue to engage the Greeks, however, in the middle. They sail away to go join Datis, who is hopefully down in Athens or close to Athens at this time. And you could see that the Greeks are preparing to basically sandwich the Persians. They successfully do that. The flanks come together. Now the Persians are trapped, fighting both front as well as behind. Artaphernes knows that at this time that is going to be a losing battle, and so the troops disperse, break formation, and head towards their waiting ships there. It is about this time that the signal is coming from Mount Penteli with a flashing shield, letting the Persians know that Athenians are ready to, or whoever is betraying the city of Athens is ready to open the gates. The Greeks also are aware that that is happening at this time as well. So it's not much of an advantage to the Persians. It just gives more energy to the Greeks to get back to Athens that much sooner. The Greeks push the Persians back to their boats, but are also trying to drive them upwards towards the marshland to inflict more casualties there. Artaphernes is boarding his ships, and he will head down to join Datis off the coast of Athens. So what about Athens? What you've got going on is you've got that the Greek hoplites have just fought this battle at Marathon. We've talked about how heavy their armor and weaponry is. They have 24 miles to cover, running from Marathon down to Athens. Pheidippides, the runner, has preceded them by running down to Athens to announce that the Greeks have been victorious at Marathon. The hoplites show up just about an hour or so before the Persian forces actually are able to make land there.
Yeah, exactly. When Datis shows up in his ships, he sees Miltiades and the Greek Phalanx arrayed against him on the beach. And he thinks it's almost magical because he literally just saw that, 8 to 10 hours ago. In Marathon, like to him that they rearranged so quickly, he was surprised and he decided to pull away.
And there's no longer any support from those Persian sympathizers within Athens. As you can imagine, they see that there's the victorious Athenians that have shown up, bloodied, exhausted, but willing to fight. And they get cold feet, and no longer does Persia have any kind of support within Athens itself. So both Datis and Artaphernes retreat with their fleets. So the aftermath and legacy of Marathon is that the death toll was surprisingly higher on the Persian side, with about 6,400 Persians that perished at that battle. There was roughly 200, a little over, a little under, of Greeks that perished. Among them, however, was Callimachus, the war archon, as well as Cynegeirus, who is the brother of the playwright Aeschylus. The legacy of Marathon, at least from the Greek point of view, is that it was a huge morale boost. It showed to the Greeks that, even though we have far fewer land forces and navy, that the Greeks can stand up to the Persians, and it basically provided momentum to unite the Greeks under a Pan-Hellenic banner, which we'll talk about in the next one. The Greeks do a lot of sacrificing to the numerous gods for their victory, and that is likely the time that Miltiades buried his helmet with the inscription dedicating to Zeus.
On the Persian side, they didn't write about this at all. Persians almost never wrote about their losses. But from what we can guess from contemporary standards and behavior in other countries, the Greeks had the view that the Persians had the view that they would return, they would force Athens to capitulate. This was just a setback, and not an even terribly complex setback at that. The Datis Artaphernes invasion force was far smaller than the invasion force that Mardonius would have brought, and so they figured they would return. And Darius was sure that he would lead the battle to return. In fact, Darius himself was quite passionate about the fact that he liked to be in the war. Xerxes and some of the other Persian kings who would show up on the battlefield would not fight, but Darius himself, even on his tomb, wrote, "I am good with the sword on foot and on horseback. I am good with the bow on foot and on horseback," because he valued his skill in the military, and he figured that he would return with a much larger force and he would overwhelm them. Of course, before he could send the next wave of attacks, he died in Susa, and he was buried at Nashqi Rostam. We talked about Nashqi Rostam before. That was where we had that a carving of all the different nations supporting him, and it was up to his son Xerxes to continue the grudge, and he would in the future. There's just one thing that I want to draw attention to. The death toll being so unbalanced at 6,400 Persians, 192 Greeks, makes perfect sense when you realize how many Persians died simply because of the rout, right? When the two side columns were destroyed and the Persians started running to their ships, the Greeks just had a bloodbath where they just kept cutting off Persians on their way to the boats. So that's why the numbers are so distorted between the two sides. And this is our last slide. So if you've got questions, go ahead.
Well, not a question, but Herodotus was interestingly pointing how Greeks didn't want to let Persian boats to leave, and there was one particular picture. Herodotus is always exaggerated, but he said one guy was holding on with one hand, and they cut one hand, and then he started holding on with another hand, and cut another hand, and he started holding on with his teeth, and that's how badly Greeks really wanted to. Revenge Persians, I guess.
Well, and one other point to truly realize, until the 20th century, until the amphibious assault at Gallipoli in February 1915, this was the largest amphibious landing in history, or attempted. And it's one of the reasons, to be honest, that people really didn't want to.
Somebody's snoring. I'm sorry, Aaron. Can somebody? Who is snoring there?
I'm snoring. I'm not snoring.
No. I said, who is snoring? I said,
it's not me.
You woke them up. You'll never know.
What I was saying is this was the largest amphibious landing in history until Gallipoli.
The 20th century, until Gallipoli, yeah.
Yeah, and it's one of the reasons why amphibious warfare was really not developed, beyond sort of minimal, almost reconnaissance forces, was because of Marathon, and people thought, well, if the Persians couldn't do it, and this was a large force, then who else could do it? And then even after Gallipoli, so it speaks, and we'll get into this, when it's my thing, but it speaks to how insane people thought the Marines were in World War II, for saying, oh yeah, we're just going to throw the whole Marine Corps at these islands, and it'll work out. And I mean, everyone thought they were just nuts, because history at that point literally said everyone's 0 for 50 on this, and that's what the Japanese thought too, and and it's pretty rational actually, but it speaks to just how incredible the Battle of Marathon was in terms of its historical importance, and you guys did a phenomenal job. I mean, this was awesome.
Thank you.
We're all joining in to say that this is, and then as Aaron had pointed out, this was the university level lecture. Thank you. I appreciate it. This was incredible. And
I have to say, Lisa did most of the legwork here. I did.
Oh, stop! You're always humble. What the hell? He's always humble, and he's telling us from the Persian. We don't even know some stuff that coming from Persian side.
Yeah, and I think that's the really important part about this is just representing a Persian voice. In this, because we have such a Western viewpoint on what happens and stuff. So really bringing that in, like the diversity and how Persia, King of Kings, ruled and all, I think is just really critical to understanding a broader picture of what happened.
Yeah, but at least
could I also make a comment about the Ionian revolt, because I think it's something in addition to what you said. One of the things is like the role of what's his name, Aristagoras. That he actually played a key role to inciting revolt, and mostly because of failed expedition to take on Naxos with satrap of Persia, Artaxerxes. I hope I pronounced it right. And
yeah,
so
no, exactly.
they failed miserably, and he was afraid that he's going to be taken out, and that's how he decided to incite this. You know, though a lot of historians believe that Ionian cities were ready because they were dissatisfied with their own tyrants. But I think the result of this, which is also very important, is that the Persian emperor, Darius, realized that that they really want democracy because they've been inspired by Athens, and he allowed them to have a democracy. So most of the Ionian cities started to have regain the democracy after this Ionian revolt. So it really played some positive effect on that. Otherwise, guys, I just want to say, excellent presentation. I enjoyed it very much. I think you did a wonderful job. Beautiful the pictures, a very good understanding, especially marathon. I learned new things, definitely. Thank you.
Thank you.
Cool.
Okay.
Cool. And look at the clock, between 30 and 40 minutes, just like we said. Boom.
I would like, hi guys. I would like to make one comment and ask one question.
Sure.
First, I would like to support what said Joe about how human body adapting to, for example, armor. For example, if you go to Bolivia, you see people who are have very big torso and very short legs, and they have to develop their lungs for going back and down and up to mountains. Or I read about a girl who was raised in Africa, and she saw a lot of monkeys who going to up and down trees, and she started to imitate them and develop very long hands. And if, for example, in Kyrgyzia right now, they put kids on the horse when they're like 3 years old. Imagine if someone here put a child on the horse, 3 years old child, these people would be in the court for the whole their life for child abuse. So it depends how body is adapting, and unless we make an experiment and raise someone in this armor for 3 years, starting with their like 3 years old, then we can understand how body adapting to these conditions. And the question is, I heard today that Richard said that which was very interesting for me, that Persians, like, they thought that they bringing light of civilizations to these people. Yes, from my point of view, I always thought that in this time people mostly went for war, first for resources, but then to please their gods and establish correct gods for these for other nations. But here they did not. Definitely, it was like colonizations, closer to colonization. So, for example, right now we bring light to civilization and establish democracy for other nations. But what was represented there as the light of civilization? What they established?
Sure. I would say that the right modern parallel for the Persian Empire would be the European Union. It's a system where it's not designed to replace the internal culture of the regions that are being conquered, and it's not designed to change the local language and self-perception. The goal of the Persian Empire is to build the economy of these places and to make the people happier and to build, and basically, right, to make a garden out of the desert. That's sort of their idea. That they want to create a paradisos on earth. And all of these people are functioning partners in that economic growth and development, and that's the light of civilization. It's music and literature and economic development and social development and all these different things. So like the right sort of parallel is not colonialism but the European Union, where the European Union wants to expand, right? But it doesn't make all the countries it's expanding to become France or Germany. They're able to retain their own unique behaviors and beliefs as long as they accept these sort of economic, cultural, and social developments that will come along with becoming a member of the European Union.
But there's a big difference. There's a big difference, Richard, which is that the emperor was sovereign, and there's no concept of that sort of sovereignty.
Sure, right? Because we believe in democracy today. But yes, I would. But like the Persian perspective on their empire is that they were the king of kings. All these other kings were allowed their own realms,
and that's what's missing from the European Union. There is no king of kings.
Right. Yeah. The president of the European Union is a joke.
Richard and Lisa, I've got one quick kind of summary question. If you had to sum up in one sentence, short sentence, what was the biggest mistake that the Persians made that caused them to so disastrously lose this encounter?
From the Persian side, they did not use the knowledge that their local allies had in Thessaly and in Macedon to understand the Greek topography in order to be able to launch either a functional amphibious invasion, which would be very difficult, or to avoid Mount Athos. Yes. If they had avoided Mount Athos, they would have been able to continue the Mardonius first strike, and they would have come at Athens from the north with a sizable force that would have destroyed them on land. So not knowing the terrain and the waters around Greece, because they had no local Greeks filling them in, which they could have done. They could have talked to their allies, their Medaizers throughout the Greek peninsula and gotten key details about the local waters and the local lands. That failure and that sort of hubris to go without that is what cost them the invasion on the first round. And you wouldn't have even needed the Datis Estefanis amphibious assault.
I would add as well that I think that there was just this concept of believing that the Persians were superior, and they underestimated what was going on culturally and the war mentality that the Greeks had, especially the Spartans. So what I was understanding is that Persians, their allies are fighting on behalf of the empire, the Persian Empire. The Greeks are fighting on behalf of their states, their city-states, and so they had more to lose, and they went into it with that much more fervor for those that fought.
I kind of have an analogy, which is the British in Gallipoli, right? It was just this sort of, we're great, and there's this sort of, the hubris meets the terrain, meets great defense, meets, it's like, you stack the cards against you enough, and you will lose no matter how.
I mean, in that battle, Mustafa Kemal, who was the colonel of the Ottoman army in command of the defense of Gallipoli, also
they were sacrificing Australians, not Brits.
Right.
But you're not like sacrificing. It's not 1,500 years ago. I mean.
That's what happened.
On the Turkish side, it was a real sacrifice. Because Mustafa Kemal ordered his soldiers. He said, "I am not ordering you to fight. I am ordering you to die, and hopefully the time it takes you to die will be long enough for us to get reinforcements."
Yep. But that's when you want to stop an amphibious assault, that's exactly what you have to do. Like that's it. Period. There's no plan B.
Richard, Lisa. Thank you for the 2 points.
Just let me add, and Lisa's point is excellent. I think there's tremendous hubris on the part of the Persians. Basically, they sat on that beach for 5 days and didn't set up a fortified camp. You know, I don't know what they're thinking. They had to have known that the Spartans weren't there yet, and yet they still didn't attack. So there's whatever's going on in the Persian mind is almost impossible to understand now.
Yeah,
no, I don't agree with that. One other point I will throw in there is the gods were favorable for the Greeks. You know, if we look at like the winds, right? So the Persian fleets being decimated by storms that came through. So there's also disadvantages that I would say, you know, probably weren't planned for, or again, to Richard's point, not really understanding the geography and what the weather was like, perhaps. But they did have disadvantages because of things like that.
Anybody also, go ahead, Paul. Go ahead.
Also, for a better understanding of the Greek side, I mean, it's not real good to just talk about the Greeks, you know, as being monolithic. You need to understand that there was really very intense factional disputes going on in nearly every Greek city all the time. So you had an older aristocracy that would be opposed by a dictator who was typically not a part of the aristocracy, or someone who is a would-be dictator who'd be trying to mobilize people outside of the aristocracy. And both of those forces would be very quick to make an alliance with the enemies of their own city in order to support their faction. So in any one of these cities, you'd find somebody that would go to the Persians and would say, okay, well, you know, if you support me against my opponents, I will, you know, open the gates. And then the Persians would say, well, we'll open our purse and we'll finance you. So there's that intense factional disputes going on. The Greeks called it stasis, which I don't really, you know, we think of stasis as being static and no change, but as I understand it, the phrase in classical Greeks meant the war of these different factions. And we see that throughout Greek history, and it gets worse and worse and worse. Never really stops.
Yeah, I was going to say that the Greek factionalism was something the Persians understood very intimately. They often would choose sides in these local factional disputes, even in the territories under their control, specifically because they knew that if somebody was more in league with them, more loyal to them, that it would be easier for them to do their policy of economic unification and political unification.
Interesting. Guys, before everybody drop out, I just want to quickly point out, first of all, Lisa, Richard, again, thank you. Throwing my hands up.
Yes,
this was amazing. Thank you so much. Clapping.
Well done.
This was incredible. Very
another level, guys. You guys took it up the next level.
Yeah. I was just sitting here mesmerized. I didn't even eat. Awesome. I was like, normally I get a bite to eat. I was like, I'm not hungry. I'm filled with knowledge.
Yeah, Lisa, awesome job. I love your background and I love the visuals.
That's great.
I hope you do more stuff like that.
So just quickly on the schedule.
Should we stop recording?
No, let's continue for that right now.
Okay.
Because I need to present the schedule. Thanks, Greg. Appreciate it. So on 10-3, we're going to continue with Lisa and Richard on Thermopylae. And obviously, it's not just Thermopylae. I mean, you know, we know the Themistocles War, and
it's going to be the Xerxes campaigns.
Yeah. Then next week Sunday, and Aaron, I'm sorry, late posting, and hopefully people catch on, and please register for Aaron. It's going to be a predecessor to Pearl Harbor, the USA response and stuff like that. And then after on the 10/17, we have Ralph, me, and Greg presenting Phoenicians, language, Carthage, and seafarers. I'll talk about seafarers. Greg is talking about Carthage, and Ralph is going to talk about Phoenician language, which was, we would say, the predecessor to a lot of the languages. Then, we have...
to be fair, the alphabet was, the language itself was not.
Yes, not the language, alphabet, sorry, you're right. Then, Richard, I still haven't heard from Vlad, so we're tentatively doing Bela of Kosovo. I will reach out to him again. If not, then Richard is going to do, wars of Israel, Israeli wars or Jewish wars, whatever you want to call it.
Sorry, yeah, I was actually looking at the schedule. There are the two Israel presentations you want me to do. There's the one of the colonialization and the early creation of the state of Israel, like the Zionist movement, and there was the one where you wanted me to do the subsequent presentation, which would be the wars once Israel's independent.
Right.
So I think the easier one to do would be to go chronologically and do the Zionism presentation in that slot, if Vlad doesn't want it.
If Vlad, okay, I will reach out to Vlad. As you know, thanks to Paul when he early caught on and said, reach out to Dido. And
either way, just give me a week's notice and I'll be fine.
No, I will give you this week. I mean, tomorrow I'll get my notice. I apologize. So Sergio is going to do a Teutonic Knight Order, which is everything, you know.
But that's in November, isn't it? November.
That's Zach? In November, yes.
Yeah.
So I want to. Yeah, I just want to give.
Peloponnese. I thought Aaron and I were going to do Sparta in the Agogi camp.
Yeah. We will do that. Yes, Agogi camp would be 10:31. Yes, that's prior to your presentation on the Teutonic Knights. I mean, we have everything in the schedule. I just don't want to read it over. What I want to draw your attention, guys, is tentatively we have another scholar, Siobhan and Joanna Katrin, I can't pronounce her last name, Friedrich's daughter, will present on Viking pioneers of women. They write the books on, Viking women, Pioneer Women series, and they're going to present that on 10/6. And on, I have to change this, Morani restaurant was moved to 10/4. So whoever can join, but if not, we can probably zoom this out, just to show what we're eating and what we're talking about, kind of like make it fun. And I started a new series, and then, you guys tell me if that's too much. It's going to be just, live broadcast into all the, social networks. And it's going to be Q&A 1-hour session, a hard Q&A. Let's say John is going to present like the first Hitler rising to power, right? So we'll be asking John to do a little bit of research, and we'll ask him questions on it. And it's going to be all purely Q&A. And the other 4 topics is, where did Hitler gone wrong on Russian front? That's going on.
I like that adjective, several.
Yeah. Kursk, Stalingrad, and Idi Amin, Uganda. That subject, I'm sorry, go ahead.
10/14 is the same date as for Plutarch, because it's also Wednesday.
Yeah, I might have to work with dates a little bit. I mean, I just wanted to present this up, put it in people's vote if they're okay with doing that. Because we had so much interest in World War II, but unfortunately we don't have enough in our schedule to work it in. And that's why I wanted to do, and it seems to be, there's a lot of participants. People want to ask questions. I wanted to make a Q&A format, and a lot of people have something to say. So I want.
And Zach, if you want to throw some in for me on the Pacific, or anywhere else, it's fine too. I mean, on World War II, because World War II is so sort of strangely configured time-wise, right? Like, you can do World War II in Africa, which is, what became Ethiopia.
You know what? Instead of doing that, why don't we do that? The German general who was really good, I could call him Fox of the Desert.
Yep.
What's his name?
Rommel.
No?
Let's do Rommel.
Oh, no, Rommel, right.
Rommel. Let's do Rommel and, his personality and him fighting, United States and UK, Africa.
You might want to reverse Kursk and Stalingrad. And
yes. I thought about that. The reason I wanted to do Kursk is kind of like with Stalingrad is off to the side, and then Kursk is really close to Moscow. But we can reverse that, obviously.
The Kursk was later.
It's hard to make sense of Kursk without knowing what happened at Stalingrad.
Yeah. Got it. Yeah. Okay. So maybe I'll put the years too, 42, 43, whatever, or 42 in the days,
That's kind of what I'm going to do with the Pacific, is just so like this one next week is going to be everything but Pearl Harbor, just so you guys know if you're Pearl Harbor.
Can you at least Pearl Harbor and the reaction? And the presentation ends up being everything but Pearl Harbor.
Yeah.
Well, no, it's everything going into it, which is, by the way, like it's all the other allies before the U.S. got in, and the Japanese and just the Pacific colonies, and just kind of everyone in this weird pre-war footing who wasn't already at war. So there's all that build up, and then it just unleashes. And then after that, I'll probably do one session, kind of like one per year. Just because each year had like an average of like 30 battles, basically, or 30 things.
Yeah,
things happening.
It's I mean, now that I'm getting into it, and at the poll, polls know that we're learning so much about it because we had such a different, knowledge base versus to what you're presenting, and then when John presented in World War II, which if anybody can help us, we can't convert the file. It was my fault. I couldn't convert the file and I couldn't post it up. So
which file?
It's a Zoom file that we loaded in our computer instead of loading it to the cloud, and I can't convert it to the presentation, to actual presentation. It's telling me it's a Zoom format, and every time I click on it, it doesn't let me convert it.
It's an MP. It should be an MP4 file.
Yeah, that's the issue.
Or you can.
Can I send it? Can I send it? It's on my Dropbox.
Yeah. I'll help you. Just text my cell, and I'll help you this week, and we can.
Oh, you're the best. Because it was such a great presentation. I wanted to post it. And guys, listen. I'm looking for a presenter on Homer. Whatever you guys want to do, Odyssey or Troy, whatever you guys want to do. Doesn't matter. We're all open.
Zach, I'm always up for that.
I was gonna say this sounds like it would be good for.
But you got back to back month. Well, it's only a month. It's going to be month difference, so it's going to be in January. So you have Xenophon, and I have your Homer.
I'm always up for doing a Homer presentation.
You got it. You got Homer because you kind of already did a prelude to that anyway with Lillentine War and all that other stuff. That was good. Richard is doing the Turkish people empire, and then I'm still looking for timeline for Roman Empire.
I mean, to be fair, the Turkish empires is a lot. Like the way you wrote it, I'm covering like 3,000 years. So.
No,
like
I need a summary.
Right?
Turkic
like
people. I need a
people.
summary.
Yeah,
no, hold on, Greg, 1 second. What I want to portray to people is there was a huge empire before Ottomans came, and it dissipated. Only Ottomans are left as far as the Turkish. Before the Soviet Union broke apart, that was the only Turkic country that was left. And so I want to convey that point. So you'll talk about from China all the way through, Caspian Sea and all that stuff. They're coming through Seljuks. That's what I wanted to convey. And then what I want to do is create then a timeline where you're going to talk about the Turks in China, Turks in Uzbekistan, Russia.
Sure, I can definitely do that. But the only problem that I see is that a lot of the states that occur in the pre-medieval period are states that form based on one person, and it's not quite clear where they start, where they end. And then, because it's quasi-nomadic tribes. Right. By the time you get to the medieval period and the foundation of Samarkand and these sorts of things, okay, then you start having states like Khiva, Bukhara, that start being, states with armies and militaries and cities. Right. But no, it'll be a little bit difficult, especially trying to get maps and trying to explain where people were. But I'll do what I can.
And one quick thing, Zach, that I'd like to do that, but I think would be a little fun too, is I'd like to do, for those of anyone around, assuming we're still pandemicking, is I like to do the history of New Year's, or the concept of New Year's and all the different celebrations across different cultures and people.
Speaking of, Happy New Year's, fellow Jews.
Yes. Happy New Year.
Shana
Happy
Tova.
New Year. Shana Tova.
Yes. Chag Sameach, as they say.
Zach, when are you doing the Roman Empire? I would like to help out with that. In January?
No, in May.
Oh, then we got time.
May 2026.
May 2024.
No, I haven't even got a timeline. The Roman Empire
it's going to be a 5-year plan.
Yes.
Okay, guys, we're almost at 3:00. Let's.
This has to be our whole life, guys.
I was going to say, I think we know what's going on for the next 4 months. I think we're okay.
So long, everybody.
Please read.
Great job, Lisa.
Great job, Lisa.
Guys.
Awesome job.
Thank you so much, Lisa. I look forward to working with you in 2 weeks.
I'll post everything, guys. All right.
Okay,
see you.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.
Bye, Lisa.